What if I told you that being gay in the Victorian era could land you in prison or worse, destroy your entire life? We often imagine that time as prim proper and obsessed with manners. But beneath the polished shoes and powdered faces was a dangerous secret. Homosexuality wasn't just illegal, it was actively hunted, and yet it never disappeared. It hid in coded letters, quiet glances, and underground circles that history barely dared to mention. So why don't we talk about it? Why did the history books skip this part? Today, we're exposing the truth. They tried to bury the love stories, the scandals, the bravery it took just to exist. Drop a comment with the time you're watching this. I love seeing where our curious community is tuning in. And if this kind of hidden history speaks to you, subscribing is totally your call. But trust me, this story gets deeper. You wake up in a world where everything looks proper, tall, hats, tight corsets, and carriages rattling across cobbled streets. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and lavender water, and everyone seems to be minding their manners just a bit too perfectly. Welcome to Victorian England, where appearances are everything, and what hides beneath them is often trembling, terrified, and tightly buttoned up. You step onto the pavement and feel the weight of the era's gaze on your shoulders. Not just because your collar's slightly crooked, but because here, deviation isn't just disapproved of, it's quietly watched, judged, and sometimes punished. The strange thing is, everyone pretends not to notice what they obviously do. You pass two gentlemen walking arm in arm, a normal gesture back then, yet your instincts tell you there's something more in the glance they exchange. A flicker too long, a smile too nervous. The Victorian world loves rules, order, and cleanliness, but it also loves secrets. And when it comes to same-sex desire, the rules get murkier, stricter, and infinitely more dangerous. Look closer, and you start to see the double lives playing out in whispers and coded gestures. A well-dressed man glancing too long at a stable boy. A maid who always finds a reason to sleep in the same bed as the lady she serves. You wonder, how do people survive when the thing they long for most must be buried under layers of etiquette and shame? Victorian society is on the surface obsessed with morality. You've seen the manuals, right? Don't talk too loud. Don't laugh too long. Don't ever, under any circumstances, be improper. But the real rule, the one not written in ink, but carved into every wall, is this: don't get caught. You could be who you are, so long as nobody ever names it. As long as you never say it aloud. Behind every teacup and every Sunday sermon is an undercurrent of fear, because same-sex attraction isn't just frowned upon, it's criminal. It's spiritual failure. It's social suicide. Even for the upper classes who could afford discretion, the danger was always there. You might be safe behind a title and some inherited land until someone decides your secret is worth exposing. Then it's not just your reputation that's ruined. It's your future, your livelihood, even your freedom. But still, people risk it. That's the wild part. Even under all that repression, love keeps slipping through the cracks. You hear about the artist circles in London, where men quote poetry to one another by candlelight, and no one says exactly what they mean, but everyone knows. You notice the melancholy in those pre-Raphaelite paintings, the kind that lingers in the gaze of two men posing together, a little too closely framed as friends. The Victorians didn't lack passion. They lacked permission. Let's pause here. Have you ever been somewhere where everyone was smiling, but nobody was saying the truth out loud? where people followed rules so hard they bent them in silence just to breathe. That was Victorian England on a good day. And here's the strange irony. While the official stance was deeply conservative, the 19th century also marked a time of curious exploration. You had scientific journals beginning to catalog sexuality badly, and often insultingly, and writers like Walt Whitman across the Atlantic putting gentle male love into verse. The seeds of modern understanding were there just buried in a field of judgment, like daisies under a marching parade of top hats. In the middle of all this, Queen Victoria herself ruled with icy grace. You might expect a monarch to be a moral enforcer, but here's a little-known twist when the British Parliament proposed criminalizing lesbianism in the late 1800s. Legend has it that Queen Victoria refused to believe it even existed. Whether the story is true or not, the law never named women. Men's love was policed. Women's love was ignored to death. You're starting to feel it now, that eerie contradiction. An era that claimed to be all about family, God, and nation, and yet had rooms where gas lamps flickered over stolen kisses and carriages where hands brushed just out of sight. The more rules they made, the more people found ways to break them quietly, fearfully but relentlessly. And this wasn't just in London. The panic spread through colonial outposts, churches, boarding schools, and parliaments. People learned to signal, without speaking, to love in silence, to find meaning in small things. A flower left on a windowsill, a borrowed book filled with underlined passages that meant far more than their literal text. You weren't allowed to love, but you could hint, gesture ache. A single glance could carry the weight of a sonnet. And this wasn't a fringe issue. Think of the names now revered in museums and libraries: artists, poets, aristocrats. Many of them had lives shaped by same-sex attraction, coded into diaries, or dismissed as lifelong bachelors. Charles Ricketts, a key figure in British art, shared nearly every waking moment with Charles Shannon. The two men designed, painted, traveled, and lived together for decades, quietly, respectfully, never named. Which raises a question: how much history do we miss because we're too polite to say what we suspect? That's where the story begins, not in the courtrooms or the headlines, but in the rooms you weren't allowed to see, in the quiet places, in the spaces where love had to hide. Now you start noticing the laws, not just the ones etched into stone or scribbled in Parliament documents, but the invisible ones, the ones hanging in the air like damp fog, clinging to every breath. You're walking past the courthouse, and you don't even need to be on trial to feel your stomach tighten. Because here in Victorian England, same-sex love isn't just discouraged, it's prosecuted. The law doesn't just disapprove, it pounces. You catch whispers about it in the newspapers. Gross indecency, unnatural acts. Phrases so vague they could mean anything, and did. The 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act, sometimes called the Labouchere Amendment, didn't name homosexuality outright. It didn't need to. Instead, it made all acts of gross indecency between men illegal, whether public or private. That meant even a kiss in the safety of one's bedroom could bring handcuffs and headlines. You glance around, trying to imagine how people even dared to love in this world. And the answer is carefully. Very, very carefully. Because the punishment wasn't just prison, it was humiliation. Total character assassination. Once your name appeared in the court records, or the local rag, you were done. No career, no future. And depending on the judge, sometimes hard labor too. Imagine being sentenced to 2 years of breaking rocks or walking a treadmill in a windowless room because of a letter. A letter, written in private, maybe even burned, but intercepted, stolen, or leaked. That's all it took. A few words could lead to a cell. Even if you weren't convicted, the mere accusation could ruin you. It gave others power, especially blackmailers. Now here's a grim little fact. Blackmail based on homosexuality became so common that it had its own dark ecosystem. Criminals didn't have to rob houses or pick pockets. They just needed to find a letter, a rumor, a tryst behind the theater, and then whisper a threat. Pay up or face exposure. People paid. A lot. Some handed over everything they had just to keep their secrets in the shadows. Some paid and paid and paid until they couldn't anymore. And when the money ran out, the silence ended. There were even detectives who specialized in morality crimes, officers who lurked outside theaters, art galleries, and gentlemen's clubs waiting for anyone who might slip. You picture yourself in a velvet-seated drawing room listening to music when the door suddenly crashes open and the police charge in, not looking for murderers, but for lovers. And this wasn't just something that happened to the careless or the flamboyant. It happened to men with power, with families with prestige. Imagine being a respected politician, like Henry Labouchere himself, the man who helped criminalize gross indecency, and knowing full well that your own colleagues were among the very people now living in fear. The hypocrisy wasn't just thick, it was institutional. One famous case in 1870 involved Bolton and Park, two men who sometimes dressed in women's clothing and were arrested on suspicion of having immoral purposes. The courts tried to make an example out of them, but the prosecution struggled. Because here's the kicker, there wasn't enough physical proof. So they were acquitted, not because society believed in their innocence, but because the law wanted bodily evidence of intimacy. And how exactly does one prove that without turning the courtroom into a circus? Still, despite the acquittal, their lives were never the same. The ridicule stuck. Their names lived on in tabloid ink, their freedom tainted by humiliation. You may be wondering, did any lawyers ever try to fight these laws? Were there any judges who showed mercy occasionally, but rarely? Because Victorian courts weren't in the business of compassion. They were in the business of upholding virtue, and they did it by crushing anything that deviated from their ideal of the moral man. Preferably married, preferably miserable. It's a little like prosecuting someone for breathing wrong, except everyone's pretending it's not air, it's poison. And you start to see how law shaped more than just behavior. It shaped architecture, movement, even speech. People learned how to speak without revealing too much. They avoided writing anything that could be misread. They memorized escape routes. Some homes had extra exits. Some diaries were written in code. One misstep, and the law would not hesitate. Does that sound absurd? Maybe, but only if you've never had to hide who you are. Real people paid the price. John Addington, Symonds a poet, an early advocate for homosexual rights, lived in constant fear of exposure. His writings, sensitive, intelligent, brave, were often kept private. He knew what could happen if his thoughts made it into the wrong hands. He tried to change the conversation, to bring some level of understanding into a legal system built on fear. But the walls were high. There's a kind of ghostly irony to it all, a society obsessed with documenting everything from births to ballroom menus had to pretend that some people didn't exist, or at least didn't love. And here's the chilling part. Many didn't just fear the law. They internalized it. Some believed they were broken, sinful, sick. That's what constant threat does. It warps your mirror until you start punishing yourself before the world even gets the chance. So you learn to smile just the right way, to nod without lingering, to let love become a phantom that visits in dreams, but not daylight. The law may only last a page or two in a textbook, but for those living under it, it was a lifetime's worth of silence. You find a small bookshop tucked between a hatter and a pastry window. The bell above the door jingles softly, and the shop smells like old ink and winter coats. At first glance, it's just another Victorian haven of poetry and philosophy. But your fingers brush across a volume that's been shelved with unusual care, as if hidden in plain sight. You flip it open and realize you've just entered another world. A quieter one, a riskier one. One where love breathes only between the lines. This is where many queer Victorians lived in metaphor, in subtext, in phrases so delicately constructed they could pass through a censor's fingers without raising alarm. You notice how often friendship feels too intense, how the word affection appears too often in letters between men who supposedly were just classmates. You begin to see that when something can't be named, it gets rewritten into glances, pauses, shared poems, and deliberate ambiguity. You leaf through letters from Lord Byron to John Fitzgibbon, where emotional declarations wear thin disguises. You reread passages from Maurice E.M. Forster's novel about same-sex love unpublished in his lifetime because the risk was just too high. You realize this was survival, writing love into fiction, because living it, in fact, could destroy you. And then there were the codes. Polaria cant slang, used mainly by men in British gay subcultures, would bloom more fully in the 20th century, but its early roots, word substitutions, playful twists, and private meanings began to sprout in the Victorian period. It wasn't just clever, it was necessary. If you could speak a language others didn't understand, maybe you could live a life they wouldn't arrest. Imagine trying to explain a romantic relationship without ever using words like love, desire, or partner. It turns every sentence into a tightrope. You start seeing it everywhere in poetry, in theater, even in the pauses between lines, in a conversation. The Victorian era birthed some of the best euphemists in history. Even Sherlock Holmes couldn't resist the mystery. Arthur Conan Doyle, though not known for promoting queer themes, directly created characters like Holmes and Watson, whose intimacy has sparked debates for decades. Was it friendship? Was it devotion? Or was it a subtle nod to a deeper bond that Victorian readers might have recognized but never spoken aloud? Not all the hidden messages stayed in books, though. You walk past a tailor's shop and see a particular green carnation pinned to a lapel. It seems like just a fashion choice, but among some circles, it signals something more. Oscar Wilde himself made the green carnation famous as a kind of quiet symbol, an emblem that could mean nothing to most, but everything to those who knew. You start to grasp the brilliance required to love someone when the world refuses your language. How many of us today would have the patience to write entire diaries in code, to memorize entire poems, just to say I see you? In an age where a tweet can spark a movement, it's humbling to remember a time when lovers risked everything to share a single sentence. It wasn't just men doing this. Women, too, navigated the unspoken. Letters between Victorian women often brimmed with longing intimacy and romantic tension. And while their relationships were less policed by law, they were equally vulnerable to social scrutiny. Two women living together might be brushed off as spinsters, But if their bond became too visible, the consequences were still severe: family rejection, institutionalization, forced separation. One famous pair, Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby, known as the Ladies of Llangollen, lived together for decades, refusing traditional marriage and building a shared life that puzzled, fascinated, and scandalized Georgian and Victorian society. Visitors came to observe them as curiosities, but beneath the novelty lay a quietly defiant love story. It's one of many. You picture a Victorian drawing room, the fire glowing low letters exchanged beneath the edge of a newspaper, poetry recited with just enough intensity to say what must not be said. You imagine someone like John Addington Symonds crafting an essay with a trembling hand, knowing he can't publish it. Or Walt Whitman across the sea, but reaching minds in England, speaking of manly love in verses that stretch beyond borders and laws. It becomes clear, this was not a silent era. It was an encrypted one. Do you think you'd have made it? Could you have survived in a world where love itself had to be written in riddles? Would you have dared to send the letter, knowing it might be your last, and yet thousands did? Their voices, though muffled by time and censorship, still echo. The ink may have faded, but the code remains etched into the margins, buried in footnotes, and stitched into first editions that once passed between trembling hands. And as you walk out of the bookshop, the wind carrying a stray page past your boot, you realize something odd. The Victorians weren't void of feeling, they were saturated with it. So much so, they had to invent entirely new ways to express it without being destroyed. In a way, that's more daring than shouting from the rooftops. And yet, even with all that careful code and quiet longing, sometimes the truth spilled out, loud, scandalous, and impossible to hide. You're standing outside the Marlborough Street Police Court now, just as a crowd begins to gather. Newsboys are shouting headlines, women in bonnets are whispering behind gloved hands, and a well-dressed man with his collar too tight is trying very hard not to look terrified. Something big is happening. A scandal, the kind that makes headlines, ruins lives, and fuels dinner party gossip for weeks. You edge closer. The words, indecency arrest, and well-known figure float through the air like gunpowder smoke. You don't know who it is yet, but you know the type of story this is. The kind where someone got caught. Someone who forgot to be careful or simply couldn't help themselves. Someone who maybe believed for a second that love didn't have to be a secret. Scandals like these weren't rare. They were inevitable. Because when a society spends all its energy trying to deny that something exists, it creates the perfect conditions for explosive exposure. The more people pretend, the more dramatic it is when the curtain falls. You hear about a young aristocrat, his name carefully omitted in the early reports, who was caught with a letter. Just a letter. But the contents hinted too strongly at affection between him and his valet. The story spread like fire through the upper class. His family sent him abroad for health reasons. The valet, however, wasn't so lucky. He lost everything. Then there was the male brothel on Cleveland Street, discovered in 1889. It serviced clients from all rungs of society, including allegedly men close to the Prince of Wales himself. The press had a field day, though not always directly. Reporters had to tiptoe using euphemisms so twisted they nearly formed knots. But the implications were clear, and the scandal reached deep into the halls of power. Arrests were made. Names were hinted at. Careers were quietly buried. It wasn't just the elite. Middle-class clerks, artists, actors, anyone could suddenly become the center of an unwanted spotlight. All it took was a raid, a letter, a jealous lover with a grudge and a good memory. You didn't need to commit a crime in the public square. You only needed to exist in the wrong way. Tabloids loved these stories. They wrapped them in outrage, framed them as moral warnings, but sold them like candy. Headlines hissed about unnatural habits, shocking exposures, and perverse tendencies, language designed to titillate even as it condemned. The hypocrisy was baked in. The same society that punished queer lives devoured them in print. Do you find that odd? That the very thing the public claimed to hate, they couldn't stop reading about. It wasn't just the content that shocked people. It was who got caught. Because the scandals often exposed the truth that queerness wasn't some lower-class sin or foreign corruption. It lived at the center of power. It sat in parliament. It painted portraits. It conducted symphonies. That's what made it so dangerous to those in charge. They couldn't just point fingers, they'd have to look in mirrors. Sometimes the courtrooms themselves became theaters. A defendant would stand accused of gross indecency trying to appear emotionless, while the prosecutor read aloud the most private details of his letters or testimony from hired spies. The jurors would look away. The reporters would scribble frantically. And somewhere in the gallery, a lover sat quietly, hands clenched white in his lap. You imagine the silence afterward, the doors swinging shut, the footsteps echoing down cold stone hallways, and outside people already deciding what they believed and whom they'd cross the street to avoid from now on. These moments weren't just personal tragedies. They were public lessons. They reminded everyone watching to stay quiet, to stay careful, to stay invisible. Even the royal family couldn't fully escape the whiff of scandal. Rumors swirled around Prince Eddie Queen Victoria's grandson about possible involvement in Cleveland Street. No charges were ever filed, and historians still debate the details, but the very existence of the rumor was enough to cause a quiet panic. Royals, after all, were supposed to be symbols of moral purity. What happens when that illusion cracks? That's the Victorian contradiction, again demanding purity while swimming in shadow. And yet, for all their cruelty, the scandals served a purpose. They carved stories into the stone of history, stories that might otherwise have vanished. They proved that these lives existed, these desires mattered, even if society pretended otherwise. You might be erased from the family portrait, but your court transcript would survive. Have you ever noticed how history remembers those it tried hardest to forget? That's why these scandals, tragic as they were, matter. They show us what the world feared and what it couldn't suppress. They weren't just about gossip. They were about identity, about truth, peeking out from under 1,000 layers of lace coal smoke and powdered civility. And for those still hiding in the shadows, every public scandal was both a warning and a strange, bittersweet proof of life. The scandals were loud, but nothing, absolutely nothing, echoed like the trial of Oscar Wilde. You know him, of course. Witty, flamboyant, brilliant, always dressed like a peacock at a funeral. Wilde wasn't just a writer. He was a walking contradiction to everything Victorian England said it admired. He was emotional in a world of restraint, theatrical in a society of stiff upper lips, and worst of all, he was open. Not open in the modern sense, perhaps, but open enough to be dangerous. You remember the green carnation from earlier, that subtle floral wink worn by certain men in the no-wield popularized it. He turned subtext into style innuendo, into art and wit into rebellion. But even Wilde, for all his intelligence, couldn't dodge the machinery of Victorian morality forever. It started with a feud. Wilde was romantically involved with Lord Alfred Douglas, the charming but volatile son of the Marquess of Queensberry. The Marquess hated Wilde furiously obsessively, and eventually left a calling card at Wilde's club accusing him of being a posing sodomite. That single card set off a chain reaction. Instead of ignoring the insult or retreating into quiet damage control, Wilde did the unthinkable. He sued for libel. You pause here, maybe rub your temples. Suing someone for accusing you of something the law considers a crime that's not bold, it's nearly suicidal. But Wilde believed in the law. He believed in beauty, in truth, in justice. He thought the courts would see through the hate and protect the poetry. He miscalculated. The trial was a media sensation. You'd be forgiven for thinking it was a play, except the consequences were blood-chillingly real. The defense produced Wilde's love letters. They brought in rent boys, some barely adults, who testified to Wilde's alleged activities. The courtroom was packed. People whispered his lines with admiration one year and spat them in revulsion the next. And still, Wilde didn't break easily. Even under brutal cross-examination, he delivered lines that would become legend. When asked if he had ever loved another man, he replied, "The love that dare not speak its name." The words hung in the air like incense and then fell like a sword. The libel case collapsed. Wilde was arrested on the spot. The very system he'd hoped would vindicate him now turned him into a lesson. Not just a man punished, but a warning etched in ink and shame. He was tried again, convicted of gross indecency, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. You picture him in prison stripes, carrying heavy buckets through cold corridors. His health broke. His spirit faltered. When he was finally released, he was no longer Wilde the wit. He was Wilde the exile. He died in France just a few years later, broke sick, and shunned by the very society that once applauded his genius. And yet, Wilde never fully disappeared. His plays returned to the stage. His books stayed in print. His quotes were etched into marble and murmured at midnight gatherings. Because for all its might, the Victorian system failed to erase what it feared. Wilde became bigger than the courtroom that tried to contain him. You see, that trial did something strange. It made queerness visible in a way the average Victorian couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't about rumors or anonymous letters. This was about one of the most famous men in the empire publicly destroyed for who he loved. The facade cracked. The whispers became headlines. For some, it confirmed their worst fears. For others, it lit a fire they wouldn't name for another 100 years. It's easy now, with history's distance, to admire Wilde's courage. But imagine being in his shoes. Would you have sued? Would you have stood in court knowing your love would be dissected like a crime scene? Would you have dared to speak your truth in a society that only wanted you silent or gone? And imagine watching from the shadows. You're not Wilde, but you know what he's on trial for. You've written the same letters. You've shared the same risks. So you fold your paper more tightly. You avoid eye contact on the street. And you wonder if it could happen to him. How long before it happens to me? Oscar Wilde was not the only man punished, but he became a symbol of arrogance, yes, of tragedy, certainly, but also of possibility. Because no matter how much the court tried to bury him, Wilde's words kept blooming. Even now, his legacy disrupts the narrative that the Victorians succeeded in silencing love. If the era built a cage, Wilde kicked at its walls until people noticed the bars. And still, After all the trials, the laws, the threats, the whispered scandals, love didn't leave. You find yourself walking down a quiet side street in Bloomsbury. The sun has dipped behind the chimneys, and the cobblestones carry a faint hush, as if even the city knows it's time to soften. Behind shuttered windows and drawn curtains, the forbidden unfolds not as rebellion, but as tenderness. Because despite everything the Victorian world threw at queer people, some still found ways to love. Quietly, defiantly, enduringly. You knock once, then twice at an unmarked door. It creaks open. Inside, gas lamps flicker velvet armchairs crowd around low tables, and the air hums with laughter that's a little too free for public life. No one says the word gay. No one talks politics, but the glances are relaxed, the touches linger, and no one's pretending not to notice. These were the long shadows where forbidden love lived not in grand declarations, but in dinner-time rituals, in shared homes, in years of togetherness carved out beneath the radar of respectability. You see two men walking arm in arm through the park, one carrying a picnic basket. To passers-by, they're just friends. To each other, they're family. You see two women renting a flat together, their furniture bought secondhand, their holidays spent in Cornwall companions, in the eyes of society soulmates behind closed doors. This wasn't rare. It was everywhere if you knew how to look. The problem wasn't that same-sex love didn't exist. It was that society refused to see it unless it could punish it, and even then, people made it work. Some entered marriages of convenience, men and women, both queer, pairing up to satisfy social expectations while quietly living separate lives. Others surrounded themselves with carefully chosen friends who understood the unspoken. A few, very few, risked living openly, usually supported by wealth class or sheer exhaustion with pretending. You think again of the ladies of Llangollen, Eleanor and Sarah, whose cottage in Wales became something of a pilgrimage site. The elite visited them. Poets admired them. They weren't hidden, but they weren't named either. Society tolerated their love precisely because it refused to define it. Or take Michael Field, two Victorian women poets, Catherine Bradley and Edith Cooper, who wrote under a shared male pen name and lived together as partners for decades. Their work was bold, sometimes sensual, sometimes strange, but always sincere. They didn't shout their relationship from rooftops, but they didn't bury it either. They made art out of it. And then there were the artists, the writers, the philosophers, who created entire worlds out of longing and secrecy. You can't read the picture of Dorian Gray, or Maurice, or even Wuthering Heights without sensing that some of these hearts beat out of sync with what society expected. The yearning is too sharp, the grief too specific. Can you blame them for writing their love into fiction, when the real thing could get you arrested, or worse, exiled by your own family? Some found sanctuary in travel. Paris, Italy, North Africa. Cities where the rules were different, or at least looser. Their Englishmen could live more freely, if only temporarily. The concept of exile wasn't just political, it was emotional. Leave England, and maybe you could breathe. You picture someone packing a suitcase, not just with clothes, but with pieces of themselves they can't show at home. A pair of love letters, a shared photograph, a tiny perfume bottle that still smells like someone they'll miss. This wasn't a vacation. It was a survival tactic. And still they came back. To their homes, their jobs, their families. They slipped back into the roles required of them. But something had changed. Once you've tasted a world where you're allowed to exist, returning to silence feels heavier. Even within the UK, there were pockets of reprieve. Some boarding schools, strangely enough, fostered intense same-sex bonds, especially among boys' relationships that were both romantic and educational. Not always healthy, not always equal, but real. Complex, emotional. The Victorians didn't have the language we have today, but they had the feelings. And sometimes those feelings turned into a kind of life. You wonder, could you have loved like that, quietly in the shadows, with all your hope folded into a breakfast table or a shared umbrella? Would that have been enough? It had to be, because the world gave no other option. And yet people still chose love over fear, chose connection over compliance. They built something in the cracks, something soft, sturdy, and surprisingly luminous. It's easy to focus on the suffering. But if you listen closely, you'll hear the laughter too. The inside jokes, the domestic rituals, the small miracles of two people who refused to let shame have the final word. The Victorian era didn't just produce repression, it produced resistance, often gentle, sometimes quiet, but always real. And in those quiet resistances, you begin to find whole worlds hidden in plain sight. You pass through Soho, now dim lanterns swaying above slick cobbles, pub doors leaking warmth and piano music into the damp air. On the surface, it looks like any other night in the city. But if you know which door to knock, if you give the right name at the right time, the night unfolds differently. The room inside is glowing velvet drapes, warm laughter, someone in a silk waistcoat tossing back champagne and tossing around opinions like confetti. You're not in a public space anymore. You're in a sanctuary. These were the hidden gathering spots. Call them what you like. Salons, societies, clubs, private events. Some had names, some didn't. Most were known only by word of mouth, and they existed solely for one purpose: to let people breathe. Here, queerness wasn't an accusation. It was a shared understanding. You walk through the room. A woman in a tailored suit smokes a cigarette in perfect indifference to the corseted world outside. A man quotes Sappho under his breath, while another nods in agreement and nudges a glass of port his way. These aren't just parties. They're survival strategies. They're the few hours a week when someone can laugh too loudly, wear too much perfume, or hold a hand without fear. Cross-dressing balls, though illegal, still happened in secret venues. London had a few. Paris had more. Men in gowns twirled with flair. Women in coats shared cigarettes. The law called it deviance. They called it freedom. In fact, much of Victorian queer life hinged on knowing where to go. There were safe tailors who wouldn't ask questions. Hotels with unspoken arrangements. Carriage drivers who knew which doors to knock on and which streets to avoid. The city had a second skin, a layer of paths, and people invisible to most vital to some. And yet every sanctuary came with risk. You remember the Cleveland Street scandal. That brothel operated by male telegraph clerks, serviced high-profile clients, and relied entirely on secrecy. It wasn't a brothel, like you might picture: no flashing signs, no red lights, just quiet rooms, familiar faces, and fragile trust. When it collapsed, so did the lives of everyone inside. So why did they do it? Why risk exposure, ruin imprisonment for a dance, a kiss, a moment of being seen? Because even the most oppressive world can't squeeze out longing. And longing, when left unspoken, turns into a kind of hunger. People needed to be around others who understood. They needed more than survival. They needed witness. The gatherings weren't always about romance or desire. Sometimes they were about music. about conversation, about hearing someone say something out loud you'd only ever dared think. And in those rooms surrounded by candlelight and careful friends, people remembered what it was like to be human again. Have you ever felt that? That soft click of belonging after a lifetime of pretending that moment when someone laughs at your joke, not because it's funny, but because they understand the ache behind it. These spaces provided that. And though they rarely lasted long, broken up by police, betrayed by guests, or folded under the weight of fear they mattered, you also start noticing how many famous names pass through these circles. Writers like Oscar Wilde, of course, but also artists like Simeon Solomon, who painted and sketched men with a softness that made critics uncomfortable. He was arrested for indecency in 1873, and though never imprisoned, long his career, never fully recovered. Still, his work whispered truths that words couldn't. There was Charles Ricketts and Charles Shannon, the artist couple we mentioned before. They hosted salons where intellect and queerness could breathe in the same air, if only for an evening. Their home became a small oasis of thought, creativity, and unspoken affection. It wasn't utopia. It was delicate, fragile, always one rumor away from collapse. But it existed. And then there were the letters, always the letters. Invitations written in code. Warnings wrapped in pleasantries. Directions concealed in poetry. The postman might not know what he was delivering, but the recipient knew exactly what to wear, where to go, and what not to say. Every queer Victorian gathering was in some way a performance. Not because the love was fake, but because the stage was dangerous. You had to know your lines. Wear your mask, hit your mark. But behind the performance was something real, something shared. You wonder now, in an age where we can broadcast every detail of our lives online, could we ever go back to living like this? Would we survive the code, the risk, the silence? The people who did, who laughed under threat of arrest, who loved under risk of exile, who danced in defiance weren't weak. They were master strategists of joy. They built fragile heavens inside a brutal world. And even when the candles went out, the warmth lingered. But even as the candles flickered out and the rooms emptied, the world outside was waiting with clipboards, white coats, and diagnoses. You walk now, past a clean, white building. Neat steps, polished brass knocker. Not a prison this time, a clinic, a doctor's office. And inside, Victorian England has found a new way to name the problem. Not sin, not crime, but illness. This is where science enters the story not as a rescuer, but as a redeemer of social order. The late 19th century saw the rise of psychology, psychiatry, and sexology. Suddenly, same-sex attraction wasn't just immoral or illegal. It was pathological. Doctors, often with good intentions twisted by cultural fear, began cataloging queer people like butterflies. They gave them labels, theories, and treatments. It wasn't about understanding. It was about control. You flip through one of their early medical texts, heavy leather-bound and full of words like inversion, degeneracy, and perversion. Homosexuality was described as a deviance from the heterosexual norm, a symptom of arrested development, or even a congenital disease. For all its academic tone, the message was clear: you weren't evil, just broken. You see how this shift, subtle at first, starts reshaping everything. Instead of being thrown in jail, you might be sent to a sanatorium. Instead of standing trial, you might be committed. Progress? Hardly. The walls were still closing in. They'd just changed color. The problem with science is that it often reflects the fears of its time. And Victorian science was terrified of losing its precious moral hierarchy: male-female, strong-weak, normal-abnormal. Deviating from that pattern was a threat not just to the family, but to empire itself. So researchers like Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis wrote volumes trying to explain same-sex attraction. Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia. Sexualis was one of the most influential books of its kind. It treated homosexuality as a mental disorder, a view that stuck around for decades. Ellis, on the other hand, was slightly more sympathetic. He didn't believe same-sex attraction was a crime or something that could be cured. But even his tone was clinical, distant, and cautious. Understanding, yes, but from behind a pane of glass. It was around this time that the word homosexual began to gain traction. Not as an identity, but as a medical label. That's important, because naming something doesn't always liberate it. Sometimes it cages it more efficiently. You look at a young man leaving a doctor's office in 1895. His coat collar is high, his steps uncertain. He went in, hoping for help. He came out with a diagnosis. He's not wicked, the doctor said, just ill, treatable. Possibly, but only with discipline avoidance, cold baths, prayer. Perhaps hypnosis. Maybe even electric shock. Yes, those happen too. You see, once something is considered curable, it becomes something to be fixed. And once people start fixing what isn't broken, you end up with a generation of bruised minds. This shift from sin to sickness also changed how families reacted. Before, a scandal was a moral shame. Now it became a private tragedy. Parents sent their sons away. Sisters were told never to speak of it. Letters were burned. Names were removed from wills. Not because of punishment, but out of concern. Can you imagine that having your entire life rewritten because someone decided your love was a malfunction, and yet some resisted? Quietly, bravely. A few doctors pushed back. A few writers began to reclaim language. The poet Edward Carpenter, for instance, lived openly with his male partner, George Merrill, for nearly 40 years. Carpenter believed same-sex love was a natural, even sacred force, and he wrote passionately about it. His home became a beacon for those seeking another way to live, to think, to be. Still, most weren't so lucky. The asylum loomed large, not just as a threat, but as a place people were actually sent. The idea was this: if you couldn't jail someone for who they were, perhaps you could treat them until they were someone else. Women, too, were not spared. Though less likely to be prosecuted, they were often pathologized. A woman who refused marriage, who showed affection to another woman, who rejected traditional roles, she might be labeled hysterical, neurotic, unwomanly, institutionalized. You walk through a hallway of polished wood and silence. Behind each door, a story, a life, a person who asked the wrong question, loved the wrong person, spoke a little too freely. There's something particularly cruel about being told your soul is sick. You can fight an accusation, but how do you argue with a diagnosis? That's what made this era so insidious. It wrapped its fear in the language of care. It said, "We only want to help," and then it took your autonomy. So no, the white coat wasn't much safer than the judge's robe. But if you look closely, even in the margins of those medical texts, you'll find contradictions. Patients who didn't stop loving. Men who met others in the waiting room. Women who pretended to be cured, but never stopped writing letters, because the human heart inconveniently doesn't follow prescriptions. You walk down a narrow lane now somewhere in the countryside. It's quiet here. The air feels different, less judgmental somehow, as if the hedgerows never cared what you whispered after dark. This part of the story isn't about London trials or medical texts. It's about the lives barely written down, the women. Because if male homosexuality was hunted, female relationships were often simply ignored. You pause on that thought. Not protected, not accepted, just left out. The Victorian legal system, in all its elaborate cruelty, never criminalized lesbianism. Not officially, not directly. In fact, when Parliament considered adding women to the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act, Queen Victoria reportedly balked. The idea that women could be involved in those sorts of acts was, she allegedly claimed, too absurd to be real. Whether or not she actually said it, historians still debate that the result was the same lesbian relationships weren't outlawed because society refused to believe they existed. And what isn't named can't be punished, right? Not exactly. Because invisibility isn't freedom. It's erasure with softer lighting. You walk through a drawing room now, warm and polished, where two women sip tea by the fire. Maybe they've lived together for years. Maybe they're even on the same lease. The neighbors might call them spinster's companions, or simply Miss So-and-so and her friend. But no one dares ask what binds them together, and no one gives them language to answer, even if they did. Victorian women lived in a society that demanded their devotion but feared their independence. A woman who rejected marriage was already suspicious. A woman who shared her home with another woman, who wore unfashionably sensible shoes, who never once seemed to be in search of a suitor. That woman was dangerous, not legally, but socially. So they learned to blend in. Letters between women from this era are often rich with emotion, admiration, longing sentiments that, if expressed between men, would have raised legal alarms. But between women, they were either romantic or charmingly sentimental, depending on who was reading. The line was always blurred, which made it safer and lonelier. There was a term, Boston marriage. It wasn't British in origin, but the concept translated well. Two women living together, often economically and emotionally intertwined without men. Victorian society mostly tolerated this so long as it looked neat, proper, devoid of suggestion. You wonder, did they really think love disappeared just because they chose not to see it? Some of these couples found deep, lasting happiness, but many walked a delicate edge. Because while the law didn't chase them, society could still punish them in 1,000 quieter ways: whispers, exclusion, condescension, pity. And then there was the medical gaze. Just like with men, doctors began noticing too close female relationships. They applied the same language of deviance and imbalance. A woman with too much education, dangerous. A woman uninterested in motherhood, troubled. A woman whose most significant emotional bond was with another woman, probably hysterical. You begin to realize that for all their different rules, the outcomes were similar: silence, shame, displacement. Still just like their male counterparts, queer women pushed back. In diaries, in poetry, in private photographs. Some disguised their feelings in metaphors. Others left them untouched, trusting time or posterity to find them. One striking example is Anne Lister, whose meticulously kept diaries from earlier in the 19th century document her romantic and sexual relationships with women in rich, unapologetic detail. She even developed her own secret code, blending Greek letters and algebraic symbols to conceal her entries. Her story, though not widely known until much later, is proof that even in an era designed to suppress, some people refused to disappear. Lister lived with her partner Anne Walker at Shibden Hall, openly enough to raise eyebrows, but cleverly enough to avoid legal retribution. They took communion together as a symbolic marriage. They referred to each other as wives. The community may have gossiped, but no one could quite stop them. And across the empire, similar stories unfolded in softer, smaller ways. Schoolgirls falling in love in boarding schools, nurses forming lifelong bonds in hospitals, actresses writing each other letters so lyrical they nearly floated off the page. They didn't need the law's attention to know they were risking something. They knew it every time someone made a joke too pointed or asked, "Why haven't you married yet?" They knew it when their relationships were dismissed as phases or fancies or nothing at all. Because being erased is its own kind of violence. You think now of all the love stories that didn't make it into the books. The names scratched out of family trees. The photographs where one woman's hand is just slightly too close to another's. The graves that read lifelong companion instead of what they really meant. But here you are, remembering them anyway, saying their names, even if history didn't. And that matters, because what wasn't named then can be honored now. And what was ignored might still echo if you listen closely enough. And now, as you walk through the foggy edges of everything they tried to forget, you begin to see what the history books missed, what they quietly skipped over, in favor of cleaner narratives, simpler categories, and untroubled timelines. Because the truth is, homosexuality in the Victorian era wasn't erased. It was whispered. It was coded, concealed, performed, punished, and survived, not because it was weak, but because it was resilient in ways the world wasn't ready to name. And that perhaps is the most astonishing part. Not that people loved despite danger, but that they loved so well, so fully, even without the world's permission. You think again of the letters folded neatly in drawers long emptied, the diaries written in code, the poems that used moonlight as a metaphor when they meant skin. You remember the quiet gatherings, the green carnations, the hidden drawings. You recall the trials, yes, but more than that, you remember the resilience, the intricate dance of survival that still somehow made room for tenderness. And as the 20th century crept closer, so did change. Slowly, painfully. But the groundwork was already there, laid down by all those whose names barely made it past footnotes. Those who risked being uninvited, unremembered, unspoken, just to feel something real in a world obsessed with illusion. Think of how many Victorian lives were reshaped around silence. How many people married for appearances, smiled for portraits, and choked on their own reflections. And yet, behind all that performance, something stirred. A quiet defiance. A soft insistence on truth, even if no one else would admit it existed. You wonder how different things might have been if love hadn't needed a disguise, if poetry hadn't needed metaphors to survive, if Wilde hadn't been tried, if Lister's code had never needed to be cracked. But then again, maybe the very act of hiding preserved something too, made it stronger, made it last, because what is hidden isn't gone. It just waits. And now here you are walking these old Victorian streets, not as a participant, but as a witness. The gas lights have dimmed. The carriages have vanished. But the stories remain. Not loud, not always clear, but pulsing under every cobblestone, tucked between every line, in a letter, lingering in every forgotten photograph, where two people stand just a little too close. It makes you think, What parts of your world are being hidden right now, waiting to be uncovered a century from now? What whispers will become the history someone else wishes they had been allowed to live out loud? You glance back at the trail you followed tonight, not just through law and scandal, but through longing laughter, resistance, and love. Victorian England may have tried to turn queerness into a shadow, a sickness, or a scandal, but it never managed to make it disappear. Not really. Instead, it lived on delicate defiant, encoded in velvet and ink. And as you finally reach the end of your walk, the sky turning that soft blue just before dawn, you realize something else. The most radical thing anyone did back then wasn't to protest or escape or even survive. It was to love. Tonight you've walked through the hidden world of homosexuality in the Victorian era, a world of secret letters, coded love, whispered resistance, and quiet bravery. In a time when being yourself meant risking everything people still loved, still hoped, still endured. Their stories weren't loud, but they mattered. Now that you've seen what history tried to forget, how does it make you feel? Surprised, moved, angry, inspired? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what stayed with you. You smell it before you see it. Smoke, rot, cheap ale. Something vaguely meaty. Maybe a stew. Maybe a rat. Then your boots stick to the floor before the door even opens all the way. Welcome to a medieval tavern where the air is thicker than the stew, and everyone pretends not to notice. The creak of the heavy wooden door is swallowed by a din of voices, crackling fire, and the occasional hiccup. The torchlight doesn't illuminate much. It just makes the shadows dance more suspiciously. The floor's covered in straw, maybe, to soak up spills, or maybe just to hide the smell. Either way, you've stepped into a place where hygiene surrendered centuries ago and never returned to claim its sword. The ceiling is low enough to bump your head if you're taller than average, which congratulations you probably are. Thick wooden beams arch overhead like the ribs of a sleeping beast covered in soot from years of tallow smoke and burning rushes. You don't know how old the building is, and neither does the innkeeper. Some parts feel ancient. Some parts look like they were repaired by someone using only wishful thinking and a slightly drunk hammer. Tables wobble, benches creak. Every surface is either sticky or splintery, sometimes both. You sit anyway, because that's just what you do. You notice the walls are sweating. Or is it just condensation from the dozen bodies packed into this glorified shed? A medieval tavern doesn't have air conditioning, of course not, but it also doesn't have windows that close properly, or chimneys that work. The room fills with fire smoke, pipe smoke, and the sharp tang of unwashed humanity. It smells like secrets and feet, but no one complains. That would take energy, and the ale hasn't kicked in yet. There's a fire roaring in the hearth which sounds romantic until you realize it's also where someone just dried their undergarments, hung like battle flags near the flames. Now your eyes adjust to the gloom. You see faces, some grinning, some glaring, some lost in thought, as if trying to remember where they parked their horse. You don't know their names, and it's probably better that way. These are people you drink, beside not ask questions about. A few nod, politely. A few look like they'd stab you over bread. But most are just trying to keep warm and drink away the day's blisters. If you want to ask them what they do for a living, expect answers like Cooper, Thatcher, or avoiding taxes. In the far corner, someone is already asleep or unconscious, head slumped on the table, drooling into a pool of ale. No one bothers them. That's practically tradition. Sleeping in the tavern means you didn't die somewhere colder. A rat scurries past your boot. You pretend you didn't see it. It pretends you didn't either. It's a mutual agreement. There's always a rat. The atmosphere hums with noise, but not the curated playlist of a modern bar. This is more like the medieval version of lo-fi background chaos. Someone's snoring. Someone else is humming a song with no discernible melody. From the hearth, a couple argues in slurred whispers over who forgot to sell the goat. A spoon clatters. A mug sloshes. You hear someone wheeze in the back, and you sincerely hope it was laughter. Speaking of mugs, the tavern's cups are all different sizes, different materials, and possibly different centuries. Clay wood pewter, even a hollowed-out horn, if you're lucky or unlucky enough. You order something ale, probably because water is for fools, and filters don't exist yet. It arrives lukewarm, barely fermented, and mysteriously cloudy. Still, it's safer than the local stream, which has a suspicious number of dead fish floating belly up this week. The serving wench, though, she'd probably punch you for calling her. That is quicker than expected. Sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, and permanently unimpressed, she slaps your mug down like she's auditioning for a wrestling tournament. She's not smiling, but she is moving, which in tavern terms is a sign of excellent service. Her apron has stains older than your grandparents. You don't ask what they are. Some things, like where the meat comes from or what's in the stew, are best left unspoken. As your mug empties, you start to feel the tavern shifting. The mood is rising like a medieval tide, rolling in on waves of cheap alcohol. Laughter gets louder. Words get sloppier. Someone in the back sings the same chorus 3 times in a row and forgets the rest. But no one minds. It's not about remembering, it's about releasing. Releasing the stress of farming fighting or feudal taxes. Releasing the ache in your back and the grime in your soul. This is where peasants become poets and blacksmiths become philosophers, for at least half a tankard anyway. There's a reason these places existed in every village town and roadside nook. Not because they offered comfort, but because they offered escape. A break from the mud, the debt, the Lord's demands. A place where you could raise a mug and forget, even just for an hour, that your roof leaks, your teeth hurt, and winter's coming faster than you're ready for. And even as your drink runs low and your bench gets harder, something in you settles. Because in this smoky, splintery, smelly room, you're not alone. You're part of something old and loud and stubbornly human. And that's worth another round, assuming your coin pouch can survive it. The funny thing is, no one ever really asks if you belong here. That's not how medieval taverns work. The rules are more flexible. If you can walk through the door, pay for your drink, and refrain from stabbing someone within the first 10 minutes you're in, no velvet ropes, no dress code, no bouncer scanning your ID while you nervously wonder if they'll spot that fake birth year you scratched onto your wax seal. This isn't that kind of establishment. In fact, this is probably the only place in the entire village where your social status doesn't matter quite as much as long as you don't make it matter. You look around and notice something strange, almost revolutionary for its time. A barefoot child sharing a bench with a man in chainmail. A tanner smelling unmistakably like death and chemicals sits shoulder to shoulder with a merchant counting coins beneath the table. A wandering friar murmurs blessings into his cup, while a woman in muddy skirts haggles with the innkeeper for another loaf of yesterday's bread. The only thing they truly share is this room and the need to forget their rank for a little while. The tavern somehow becomes an equalizer. Nobles won't frequent the really grimy ones, not openly at least, but lower knights or fallen lords with empty pockets. They're regulars. Some even show up in half-polished armor, hoping it still earns them a free drink or a bit of respect. Usually, it just earns a shrug and a spot near the fire if it's cold enough. Your titles mean less when everyone can smell how long it's been since your last bath. But don't think that means anything goes. There are rules, even if they're unwritten. Don't knock over someone's drink unless you're spoiling for a fight. Don't touch the barmaid unless you enjoy getting whacked with a ladle. And above all, don't cheat at dice. That last one's a death sentence socially, and possibly literally. Remember, in a world without CCTV, grudges are resolved with fists, not evidence. Of course, there's no shortage of strange regulars. There's always someone who seems to live here, perhaps a man with a milky eye and suspiciously good hearing, always seated near the hearth. Or an old woman who never orders but always occupies the best corner seat, muttering to herself and petting a cat that might not even exist. These figures blend into the background, like smoke into wood, part of the architecture. No one questions their presence. They belong because they always have. And if you're wondering who doesn't belong here, well, it's not always about class or cleanliness. It's about behavior. You could be dressed in rags, but if you respect the rhythm of the room, the space accepts you. Walk in acting superior, too loud, too proud, or too curious, and you'll feel the atmosphere stiffen like old bread. It's an invisible current that shifts when a stranger pushes the wrong buttons. The worst thing you can be here isn't poor, it's arrogant. This wasn't just a matter of etiquette. It was survival. In a medieval world where diseases spread faster than gossip and food shortages were regular guests, cooperation mattered. Tavern life was a delicate balance between chaos and community. And if that meant you had to share your bench with someone who smelled like he wrestled a pig that morning, well, so be it. Take a moment to imagine a modern bar working this way. No ID, no card minimum, no bouncer. Just an open door and the shared understanding that if you cause trouble, you deal with the consequences immediately and often loudly. Would it work today? Or have we grown too used to surveillance and structure to trust that kind of human chaos again? It's this exact absence of formal structure that makes the tavern both inviting and dangerous. There are no posted hours, no closing time. The night ends when the ale runs dry, or the candles do. There's no menu nailed to the wall. You get what's on offer. And what's on offer depends entirely on who's been by, with goods, favors, or livestock. The barkeep might accept coins, or eggs, or a length of wool if it's been a slow week. You want a drink? What do you have to trade? And speaking of the barkeep, he's seen it all. Lovers quarreling over goats, monks caught smuggling wine, and once allegedly a nobleman who danced naked on the table before realizing he was in the wrong town. But more on him later. For now, you keep your head down, sip your cloudy ale, and try not to draw too much attention. There's a sweet spot here in this crowd of the tolerated, the ignored, and the quietly tolerated again. No one cares what you did before walking in. What matters is how you handle yourself now in this thick soup of smoke, sweat, and second chances. You're not a lord or a peasant in here. You're just another body trying to get warm and forget the world outside. Eventually, your stomach reminds you it exists, and not gently. It grumbles like a mutinous crewman demanding better conditions. So you wave over the woman with the apron stained by what might be 3 different centuries of culinary history and ask the question everyone asks, even though they already know the answer. What's on the menu? She doesn't laugh. She just squints at you and replies, stew. Of course it's stew. It's always stew. The eternal medieval tavern staple, because it's easy, cheap, and impossible to identify after the 4th hour of boiling. You glance toward the hearth and spot the pot, huge, black, and bubbling, ominously, with something brownish-green and vaguely lumpy. It's been simmering since sunrise, maybe longer, with new ingredients added every few hours, like an ever-evolving potion. Is that a carrot, maybe? Is that a bit of rat tail? You don't ask. Alongside the stew, there's usually bread hard enough to chip a tooth if you're not careful. A slice is slapped down on the table beside your mug, dense and rough, like someone baked a rock. But soak it in the stew long enough, and it becomes edible-ish. And you'll eat it, because what else are you going to do? Starve people in this century have done worse. Trust me, if you're lucky, or if you're in a slightly fancier establishment, say one near a well-traveled road, you might get more adventurous options. A slab of salted pork, some pickled onions, a pie that's mostly crust and mystery. The meat, if you can call it that, is either overcooked to leather or suspiciously pink in the center. You chew carefully, half wondering whether this meal will nourish you or become a future cautionary tale. And then there's the drink. Ah, yes, the drink. You think you've tasted bad beer? You haven't. Not until you've sipped ale that was brewed in a wooden tub next to someone's laundry and filtered through hope and old rags. It's flat, cloudy, and sometimes sour, but it's wet and it doesn't kill you, which is a low bar, but one you learn to respect here. If you're feeling brave or foolish, you might try mead. Sweet, sticky, and stronger than it looks. It was the medieval version of a wild card cocktail. Drink too much, and you'll either propose marriage to the barkeep or wake up in a hayloft you've never seen before. And then there's the real wild card, something called ale barm. Imagine beer's unruly cousin that was left in the sun too long, flavored by yeast leftovers and regret. Still interested? There's something oddly charming about the way tavern food ignores presentation. No garnishes, no plates with drizzles. No one asks about gluten. It's function over form, survival over satisfaction. And yet every bite carries the history of people who worked, walked, and warred harder than most of us ever will. It's not delicious, but it's earned. Take, for example, the famous pottage, a thick porridge of grains and vegetables that was the backbone of tavern cuisine for the lower classes. Every region had its variation, but none of them were glamorous. Think oatmeal, but with cabbage and turnips instead of strawberries. And yet, for a peasant or a tired traveler, it was gold. It filled your belly and gave you just enough energy to shovel mud for 6 more hours. And believe it or not, sometimes taverns even had seasonal luxuries. Eels were popular, not because people loved them, but because they were cheap, abundant, and didn't require much preservation. In cities near rivers, a bowl of eel stew wasn't out of the question. Slippery, shiny, and definitely not something you'd find on a modern pub menu unless your pub is very experimental. And now that you've tasted the food and drink, aren't you curious how they kept it all from going bad? The answer is, they didn't. Food spoilage was a constant companion. Spices, when available, were often used to mask bad meat. Salt and vinegar helped preserve, but not for long. Bread went stale. ale went sour. And once it did well, just pretend you didn't notice. Your stomach might forgive you. Probably. Yet somehow, people kept eating. They sat hunched over their bowls with soot on their faces, scraping the bottom for the last bit of turnip or pork fat, and they made do. Because they had to. Because even questionable stew in a smoky tavern was better than nothing on a cold, unforgiving night. It makes you wonder, could you stomach it? Would you trade your app delivery for a ladle of stew that smells like 3 kinds of barnyard, just to feel warm and welcome in this place? Because here, food isn't about pleasure. It's about being part of the room. About slurping in rhythm with the man beside you who hasn't bathed in a week. About nodding across the table with your mouth full because your hands are too greasy to shake. It's communal. It's rough. It's real. And it's only going to get weirder from here. You start to realize there's one person everyone watches even when they pretend not to. Not the loud drunk in the corner. Not the musician tuning his broken lute. It's the one behind the bar, or in some cases behind the pot of stew, the pile of mugs, and the line of debts. The innkeeper. This is not a man or woman to underestimate. They don't wear a crown, but they rule this place more absolutely than any king rules a court. With a glance, they can quiet a crowd. With a grunt, they can decide if you eat sleep or get kicked into the mud. Most of the time, they don't talk much. They don't need to. The regulars already know what every grunt, nod, and raised eyebrow means. Behind that weather-beaten face is a catalog of secrets. Everyone comes to the tavern eventually, merchants, knights, tax collectors, bandits, farmers. They all drink, they all talk, and they all forget the walls have ears. Except it's not the walls. It's the one polishing the mugs. The innkeeper hears about land deals before the ink dries. They know which marriage is on the brink, which stable boy snuck into the noblewoman's chambers, and which monk has been drinking more mead than morals allow. They're the village's unofficial historian therapist, and if needed, enforcer. You want a secret kept, good luck. You want a rumor spread, say it near the hearth, and it'll be halfway across town before your spoon hits the bottom of the bowl. And yet there's respect, even from those who outrank them on paper, because the innkeeper holds the social currency of survival, food, fire, shelter, and silence. They can kick you out into a thunderstorm or offer you a back room and a bowl of stew on credit. Sometimes they don't even ask for money. They ask for stories, or favors, or silence in return. That's worth more than gold on the right night. You glance again and see the old man, barrel-chested, missing 2 teeth, wiping his hands on a cloth that hasn't been cleaned since the last king died. He doesn't smile often, but when he does, it feels like a sunrise in winter. You think maybe you've earned a speck of trust, or maybe he just likes your face. You hope it's the former. In many towns, the tavern keeper was more than a business owner. They were a gatekeeper of information and a buffer between travelers and the unknown. If someone wandered into town, they ended up here first. And if they caused trouble, the innkeeper was the one who either warned the town or quietly dealt with it. There are tales, some true, some definitely exaggerated, of innkeepers who stopped raids, who saved travelers, who tipped off sheriffs, or even poisoned bandits trying to start trouble. One legendary tale from 13th century France tells of a widow who ran her tavern with such iron discipline that she once knocked out a drunken knight with a roasting spit after he insulted her stew. The knight woke up 3 days later, apologized, and became one of her loyal customers for life. The tavern keeper walks a line between servitude and sovereignty. Technically, they serve, Realistically, they reign. And like any good ruler, they keep their network tight. The barmaid, probably a cousin. The boy sweeping his nephew. The old man sleeping near the fire. His father pretending to nap while watching everything. It's not just a business, it's a dynasty. Passed down like armor, dented and stained, but reliable. Now you start to see the innkeeper in a different light. Not just a bartender, not just a cook, a pillar. The one who stands when everyone else sways. The one who remembers when the room forgets. And if you ever get the chance to earn a story from them, a real one from the years before their beard turned gray, treasure it. Because they don't share lightly. They've watched lives begin and end in this very room, seen fortunes flip like dice on a crooked table. What they know could unravel families, or save them, depending on the tilt of a head or the warmth of a bowl. So you raise your mug in a subtle toast, not to royalty or warriors, or even the stew, but to the person behind the bar. Because in this wild little world of flickering firelight and shifting loyalties, the innkeeper is the one constant. And somehow, knowing that makes the floor feel a bit sturdier under your feet. But sturdy doesn't last long in a tavern, not when the sun dips, the ale deepens, and the chaos starts tuning its instruments. You hear at first the twang of a lute string being plucked too confidently by someone who may or may not be sober. Then a goat bleats. Yes, a goat. It's unclear whether it belongs to the tavern a guest or just wandered in for the warmth, but no one's particularly concerned. The line between customer and livestock is surprisingly thin after dark. And just like that, the tavern shifts. It was a dining hall. Now it's a stage. The benches creak as people lean forward. Someone moves the sleeping drunk slightly, so he slumps more artistically. A candle is lit near the front, casting a theatrical glow across the mud-streaked floorboards. The musician clears his throat as if preparing for a royal concert, then strums a few notes that sound like an argument between two spoons. But no one minds. They clap. They cheer. They shout suggestions, none of which are helpful. The lute player, unfazed, launches into a ballad about a milkmaid, a knight, and a misunderstanding involving a misplaced chicken. The lyrics are barely coherent. The rhyme scheme abandoned ship halfway through, but it's hilarious and weirdly moving. And when the refrain hits something about trousers and dishonor, the whole room joins in like a drunken choir. Entertainment in medieval taverns wasn't polished. It wasn't professional. It was participatory. Everyone was the audience, but also potentially the show. If you could juggle 3 apples or recite a bawdy limerick, you were golden. If you couldn't, well, maybe someone would toss you a turnip out of pity. Or at least not boo you too loudly. Occasionally, a real minstrel would pass through a wandering performer with actual training, possibly even permission from a noble to perform. They'd arrive with a harp, a collection of tattered songs, and tales of distant towns, sea monsters, or royal scandals. And if they were any good, the innkeeper might even feed them for free. After all, a good story could silence even the rowdiest crowd faster than a threat. Other nights, the tavern became a theater of improv chaos. Someone might challenge another to a drinking song duel. 2 blacksmiths might act out a mock sword fight with fire pokers. Someone would definitely try to dance on a table, and someone else would definitely regret encouraging them. Even the goat might get involved. Once a traveler swore he saw a goat crowned king of the evening after it butted a tax collector out the door. The jury's still out on whether that actually happened. Of course, music wasn't the only entertainment. Games were just as popular. though calling them games might be generous. Dice were always in motion, often carved from bone worn smooth from years of rolling. The rules? Fluid. The stakes? Sometimes high. A good roll could win you a meal, a mug, or a night with the softest spot near the fire. A bad roll could cost your shoes. There were also riddles, rude ones, clever ones, ones passed down from generation to generation. If you solved one quickly, you were a hero. If you flubbed it, you were mocked gently, or not depending on the ale level in your mockers. The point wasn't to win, it was to belong. And nothing brings people together quite like collectively laughing at a rhyme involving a bishop, a duck, and an outhouse. What's striking is how necessary all this noise is. Life outside the tavern is repetitive, harsh, predictable in all the worst ways. But in here for a few hours, anything can happen. The blacksmith becomes a poet, the washerwoman a singer. Even you, with your tired legs and full belly, start tapping the table in time with the music, forgetting just how exhausted you felt 5 minutes ago. And in a way, this was their version of Netflix. No screen, no script, just flickering firelight real-time storytelling, and the thrill of not knowing what the goat might do next. Would it interrupt the love song, eat someone's hood, headbutt the minstrel mid-verse? You stay because you want to know. But as the music swells, the mugs clink, and someone in the corner tries to harmonize through hiccups, you feel it again. That sense that this room is more than a shelter. It's a release valve, a temporary reality where everyone forgets titles, debts, frostbite, and feuds, where even a bad performance is better than silence, and a goat's bleat can earn more applause than a bishop's sermon. And you're part of it now. One more pair of clapping hands in the dim, smoky dark. Just when the laughter's loudest and the lute is slightly less out of tune, it happens an argument. It always does. Maybe someone rolled the dice a little too well. Maybe someone reached for the wrong mug. Maybe someone insulted the stew. Whatever the cause, it's suddenly louder than the music. Two men stand chairs scraping. Voices rise like the temperature in a forge. The mood shifts so fast, you can hear a tankard drop, and you do. No one rushes to break it up. Not yet. This isn't a modern bar, with panic buttons or bouncers built like siege towers. This is a medieval tavern. You let the heat rise a bit. See if it fizzles or erupts. The crowd pulls back slightly, forming an instinctive ring around the rising tension, like sharks circling a shipwreck. Bread crusts and bones are swept out of the way. Tankards held tightly, not for drinking now, but maybe for throwing. The first blow is almost always theatrical. A shove, a splash of ale. A dramatic insult, something about someone's mother-sister goat. Then a punch thrown like a declaration of war. It rarely lands well. The attacker is half drunk, the floor is uneven, and the bench gets involved, tripping him with perfect comedic timing. Cheers erupt, because this is now officially entertainment. The innkeeper watches. He's seen worse. He'll intervene when the blood starts, or the furniture breaks, whichever comes first. Until then, he lets the crowd police itself, and the crowd is merciless. They jeer, egging on both sides like spectators at a pig wrestling contest. Bets are placed. Someone starts humming a tune that doesn't match the mood at all. It's chaos wrapped in cheer. Eventually, it escalates. A knife flashes small, rusty, more threatening in theory than execution. The innkeeper moves then. No words, just a thud as a club lands on the table. Not swung, just shown. The message is clear. Not tonight. The knife disappears. The men, now panting and reeking of barley and poor choices, are separated and plunked down on opposite sides of the room. No one apologizes. No one expects them to. They sip in silence, licking wounds and pride. This is normal. Fights in taverns aren't breakdowns. They're pressure valves. Life is rough out there. Cold fields, stubborn lords, back-breaking labor, injustice with a side of scurvy. Sometimes you bring that storm inside, and sometimes it breaks on someone's chin. But here's the surprising part. No one holds a grudge. Not for long. The man you almost punched tonight might be the one hauling you out of a ditch tomorrow. That's how communities work when survival depends on cooperation. You fight. You drink. You mumble something close to peace. And then you pass out under the same roof, warmed by the same fire. The furniture, on the other hand, rarely recovers. That stool wasn't built to withstand a body slam. You see it now, one leg cracked like a dry twig. A dent in the wall marks where someone's head didn't quite connect but came close. A trencher, a thick wooden plate used more as a personal space marker than for actual food, lies in the corner like a fallen shield. The battlefield is littered with crumbs and pride. Still, the room resets. That's the magic of the medieval tavern. It breathes contracts and expands like a living thing. Moments ago, it was a stage, then a wrestling pit. Now back to normal. Someone pours another round. The lute player, unfazed, picks up where he left off his song, now somehow incorporating the fight as a heroic epic. The crowd laughs and the tension evaporates. Modern places have rules and repercussions. Taverns, they had rhythms, patterns born from familiarity and survival. The regulars know when to duck, when to laugh, and when to grab a pitcher and quietly help mop up the mess with yesterday's bread. Every now and then, though, things did get out of hand. Real damage, real danger. That's when the law stepped in, or more often the local strongman with a cudgel and a grudge. But most of the time it never got that far. The tavern didn't want outside eyes. The problems that started here stayed here. Resolved in half-hearted apologies, communal silence, or shared hangovers. And if you're wondering whether women joined in these brawls sometimes, not always with fists. Words were just as sharp. A well-timed insult from the barmaid could silence a drunk faster than any mug to the head. And if things got too rough, she had a way of calling out to the innkeeper that sounded sweet but meant business. You sit back. Now your own mug, steady in your hand, watching the firelight bounce off the newly formed bruise on someone's temple. And you wonder, was that really a fight or just a particularly aggressive form of friendship? Because here, in the heat and haze of the tavern, pain and play exist in the same breath. And tomorrow, they'll all be back. New stories, same mugs, maybe one fewer stool. Now that the noise has simmered back down and the fight's been folded into tonight's lore, you start to notice something subtler, quieter than a song, more secret than a brawl. It's the whispers, the glances, the way certain people drift toward the stairs one by one, casually, as if stretching their legs or checking the weather, except it's midnight and no one checks the weather in their shoes. You start to realize the tavern has layers. What you've seen so far is just the surface. Below it, or behind it, or above it, depending on the structure, things get more negotiated. Rooms for rent, beds that aren't really beds, company that doesn't ask your name but might ask for coin, or food, or discretion. No one talks about it directly. Not the regulars, not the innkeeper, not even the goat. But you notice the signs. That side door that never quite closes. That woman with too much rouge and too few questions. That traveling merchant who came in alone and somehow left with an extra smile and lighter pockets. This isn't a brothel officially, but unofficial doesn't mean untrue. Medieval taverns were often the unofficial everything. Hotel dining hall, post office, confessional booth, marriage counselor, matchmaking service, and yes, occasionally a place to strike deals of the flesh. When privacy was a luxury, even a curtained-off alcove near the kitchen could count as a room. And while not every tavern dabbled in these moonlit arrangements, many did quietly, pragmatically, and with little fuss. The women, or sometimes men, who offered company weren't necessarily outcasts. In fact, they were often woven into the tavern's fabric. They served drinks, cleaned tables, shared gossip, and knew exactly when to smile and when to vanish. They were observant, adaptable, and rarely surprised. Some had arrangements with the innkeeper. Others worked independently. But all of them knew that charm was currency, and safety meant knowing who to trust. You spot one of them now, a woman leaning on the post near the stairs, watching the room like a queen in her quiet court. Her eyes flick from table to table, not with judgment, but calculation. She knows the room better than the musician, better than the drunkards, maybe even better than the innkeeper. She nods to someone, then disappears up the steps with him. No one reacts. It's just part of the tavern's breath. Sometimes it's not about sex. Sometimes people just want warmth, a bed, a place to talk, to cry, to not be alone. The world outside is cold, literal, and figurative. Inside, if you have coin, you can buy softness, or at least the illusion of it. And illusions can save people more than the truth ever did. Other nights, the rooms upstairs serve different secrets. Backroom meetings, hidden letters, smuggled items slipped beneath floorboards. In this century, there's no chain of emails or paper trails. There's a nod, a pouch of coin, and a whispered location. And 9 times out of 10, that location is the tavern. You've heard that in London during the reign of Edward III. Entire plots were exchanged in tavern corners, while the church wrung its hands about morality. But no one could stop it. Even the clergy visited inns when they traveled. Even they needed warmth and food. Everyone came through the tavern, eventually, thieves, preachers, pilgrims, widows, knights, and that meant everyone could be watched. Some of the most infamous scandals in medieval towns began in places just like this. A letter handed off to the wrong person. A name said too loudly. A glance held too long. And suddenly, a town gossip becomes a royal problem. It's hard to remember now, with the music playing and the mugs refilled, but every room upstairs has stories the floorboards are tired of hearing. The innkeeper, of course, pretends not to know. But you know better. He hears every creak on the staircase, every coin passed under the table. He just chooses when to care, because that's the economy here, not just of goods, but of silence. And before you judge too harshly, remember survival looks different to everyone. For some, it's selling cloth. For others, it's selling secrets. And for a few, it's selling warmth in a room that otherwise offers none. The tavern doesn't moralize. It doesn't ask where you've been or what you've done. It just asks if you're hungry, thirsty, and quiet when the door shuts. So you sit a little straighter now, realizing that the stories being told aloud are only half the truth. The rest is happening in shadows behind curtains, behind closed doors, behind polite nods and practiced smiles, and in a place where nothing is private, The real currency is knowing what not to repeat. You've been here long enough now to feel the rhythm. Eat, drink, laugh, argue, whisper, vanish. But just when you think you've seen everything this wooden box of chaos has to offer you, start to notice the quieter transactions. Not the food, not the favors, deals. They happen fast, quiet, half buried under conversation and candlelight. Two men lean in, hands clasp. Something passes beneath the table, a pouch, a folded scrap of parchment, maybe a carved token that means more than it looks. You're not supposed to see it, but you do. And you wonder just how much business is really being conducted here in between stew and songs. Because for all its noise and heat, the tavern is a marketplace of more than meat and mead. It's where plans are made, alliances are formed, and enemies are at least temporarily tolerated. You're watching a kind of theater, but behind the laughter is strategy. Behind the toast, a truce. Behind that man offering a drink, maybe a bribe. In towns where no one trusts the sheriff and letters take weeks to arrive, the tavern is where power actually shifts. Guildsmen meet by the fire to fix grain prices. Smugglers share maps drawn in soot. Rival families nod across ale, silently agreeing to keep knives in sheaths at least until spring. Even in smaller villages, the same dance plays out in miniature. A thatcher makes a deal to repair the baker's roof in exchange for bread through winter. A widow lends coin to a shepherd with 2 sheep and no luck. A messenger carrying royal orders stops for stew only to accidentally mention a caravan route loud enough for the wrong ears to hear. And sometimes the deals are darker. Someone pays someone else to forget what they saw, or to make sure a certain cart doesn't leave town on time, or to mention casually that the tax collector likes to ride alone through the woods on market day. There are no contracts, just ale and nods, and the unspoken threat that if you betray a tavern deal, you might not be welcome next time. And that could mean sleeping in the rain, or worse. Still, the deals aren't always about betrayal. Sometimes they're about protection. A merchant passing through hires a local lad to watch his horse. A desperate tenant begs the innkeeper to slip word to the reeve that rent won't be ready. A mother offers a homemade poultice in exchange for safe passage for her son, who's misunderstood by the local authorities. In the flickering candlelight, these transactions shimmer like heat waves, real but hard to grasp. You try not to stare, not because you're afraid, but because everyone here knows better than to watch too long. Information flows, but only in one direction. If you catch it going the wrong way, you become part of the story. And not in the fun, remember the goat kind of way. And the innkeeper, of course, sees it all. Sometimes he mediates. Sometimes he ignores it. Sometimes he adds a name, a location, or a price. He doesn't speak much, but his silence is its own form of currency. Everyone pays him, whether they realize it or not. It reminds you a bit of those old mafia movies, except instead of tuxedos and polished shoes, it's mud-caked boots and flea-bitten cloaks. The stakes are different, no luxury cars or offshore accounts. But the principles are the same: loyalty, reputation, and leverage. Break a promise, and word spreads faster than the plague. Keep your end. And next time, someone saves you a spot by the fire. Once, according to an old tale, a tavern deal in Flanders led to the toppling of an entire local lord. A disgruntled servant passed a sealed scroll to a rival noble's spy for the price of 2 silver coins and a fresh leg of lamb. History may not remember the man's name, but the tavern never forgot him. Neither did the lord. His manor mysteriously burned down the following spring. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe someone remembered who sat near the hearth that night. There's something strangely comforting about it in a gritty sort of way. In a world with no insurance, no contracts, no 24/7 legal hotlines, this system works. Because it has to. Because in this room, your word, your nod, your silence is all you've got. And in many ways, that's worth more than gold. So you settle deeper into your bench, suddenly aware of how many little glances are traded across the room. How many mugs are refilled just a second too late? How many shoulders brush in a way that means more than it should? And how beneath the songs and stew, the real tavern hums like a hive restless buzzing alive with plots and promises. You don't hear them arrive, you feel it. The room tightens just slightly, like someone pulled a thread too tight through worn fabric. A few heads lower. A laugh dies mid-breath. The lute player pretends to be very interested in tuning his one functioning string. That's how you know the sheriff just walked in. Not a man in shining armor, mind you. That's the stuff of romance tales and noble courts. This sheriff wears the same mud as everyone else. His boots thud with tired authority, and his coat, once official-looking, is now stained with stew ink and what you really hope is horse. He's flanked by two deputies, younger, and trying far too hard to look menacing. One of them has a chin too sharp for his face and eyes that haven't yet learned to pretend they don't see things. The sheriff doesn't bark or glare. He doesn't need to. His presence alone does the job. This is his 6th tavern this week, and likely the 4th, where someone forgot to pay a fine. He scans the room not looking for a fight, just for the face that owes him something. Or maybe someone who said too much last night, or didn't say enough. You wonder, does anyone actually like the sheriff? Probably not. But that doesn't mean they hate him. He's necessary like rain or taxes or that hard crust on old cheese. He keeps order loosely defined. He keeps peace mostly through fear. And everyone knows that sometimes the sheriff takes a little extra for himself, some bread here, a favor there. But no one calls it corruption. They call it pragmatic. Tonight, though, he's not here for food. He's here for someone. The mood shifts as he makes his way toward the back. People subtly shift their bodies to block views to shield familiar faces. But there's always someone who gives up the game a nervous glance, a twitch, a barely audible uh-oh. That's all the sheriff needs. He points the deputy's move, and within seconds a man is hauled up from his bench with all the grace of a sack of turnips. He protests, of course. They always do. Wasn't me. I paid. She lied. No one said there'd be taxes this month. But the sheriff doesn't argue. He just says talk later and drags the man out into the night. And here's where it gets interesting. The room doesn't erupt. No one protests. No one throws punches. Why? Because that's the balance. The tavern may be wild, unpredictable, but it still lives under a sky where law exists, even if that law is muddy and full of holes. The moment the sheriff enters the building, remembers its place, temporarily. Once the door closes again, the air exhales. People glance around, like waking from a dream. A few mutter curses. One man chuckles darkly. Someone toasts to not being that guy. And just like that, the room repairs itself. You half expect the innkeeper to shout, "Where were we?" and the music to resume exactly on beat. But it lingers. That sense that the tavern exists in a pocket of freedom until someone with a badge reminds everyone it doesn't. You might be surprised to learn that some sheriffs were regulars themselves. In small towns, there was no escape from overlapping roles. One week, you're enforcing a tax, the next, you're borrowing stew on credit. The innkeeper knows this. So does everyone else. That's why the sheriff rarely throws his weight around here, unless it's absolutely necessary. Because even a man with power needs a place to eat, and drink, and forget. Sometimes, late at night, the sheriff himself sits in the corner, quiet alone. No badge, no deputies. Just a man with tired boots and too many secrets. He drinks slowly, nods to the music, and leaves before the room forgets who he is. You wonder if he ever wishes he were just another drunk with nothing to lose. Taverns saw more law than courtrooms did. Disputes were settled here with handshakes, punches, or silence. Witnesses were made and erased over mugs of mead. Confessions were whispered into half-empty bowls. And if someone fled justice, this is where you learned whether the room would protect them or not. You can't help but marvel at how flexible the rules are. How justice here isn't blind. It just squints, adjusts, and sometimes takes a nap by the fire. There's a kind of code, sure, but it's written in spilled ale and nods not in ink. And when the sheriff shows up, it reminds you that even the freest feeling places are still under watch. And yet tomorrow, the stew will bubble. The goat will bleat. The dice will roll. And the tavern will keep breathing exactly as before. Because no matter who walks in with a badge, it's the people who stay behind that keep the place alive. The fire has shrunk now, just a few glowing logs whispering their last warmth into the bones of the tavern. The smoke has settled into the beams like a memory. The crowd has thinned. Not emptied mind, you just softened. The loudest left first. The lovers followed. The fighters either wandered home or curled up where they dropped. What remains are the slow drinkers, the quiet watchers, and you. Your mug's long empty. The stew pot is crusted shut. Even the goat is asleep, snoring gently, under a bench, like it pays rent. The innkeeper moves slower now, shoulders drooping, but his eyes still catch everything. A final log is nudged into the coals. A stool is righted, though no one will sit on it again tonight. You sit in silence, longer than you meant to. Maybe because your legs are tired. Maybe because you're not sure where to go. The tavern has this strange effect. It draws you in, and then somehow convinces you there's nowhere else worth going. A kind of spell, brewed not in a pot, but in laughter noise and muddy footprints that all blur together until this place feels more real than the road outside. You've been here only hours, but the place has changed you. Or maybe it's revealed something you didn't know was already there, the way you lean toward stories, when they're sung the way you listen, when the dice roll, the way your body relaxes, when no one's asking anything of you except to eat, drink, and not stab anyone. And yet a part of you knows it's time. The coals are almost out. The innkeeper has begun that slow, subtle ritual of closing not with locks or announcements, but with the weary rhythm of someone who's ended thousands of nights just like this. He blows out one candle, then another. He doesn't look at you, but somehow you feel the invitation to rise. You glance around one last time. The table with the wobbly legs still leans. The bench you sat on has your imprint now. A wet ring from your mug stains the wood in a perfect, unimportant circle. You realize you've left a mark here, however small. And this place, this stubborn, smoky, echoing box of humanity, has marked you too. Some never leave. Not because they're trapped, but because they no longer want to rejoin the world outside. You've seen them, those who sleep by the hearth, wake to sweep the floor, take coin for errands no one remembers asking for. They become part of the tavern, the way ivy grows into stone. You can't tell where one ends and the other begins. And maybe that's not such a bad life, to live in a place where people come to forget their burdens, where stories unfold nightly, like drunken theater, where music is bad but honest, where bread is hard but shared. A place where everyone is equal under smoke and candlelight, where no one cares where you came from, only how well you hold your ale. But you're not staying. Not tonight. You stand. The bench creaks in protest, as if it too knows it won't see you again. The floor feels different beneath your boots now, less sticky, more familiar. You nod to the innkeeper. He doesn't nod back, but he does something better. He wipes the bar in slow circles, pauses just for a moment, and grunts softly. A sound that says you were here and you did no harm. In tavern language, that's practically a standing ovation. You walk to the door. The wood feels heavier now. Maybe it always did, but you only notice it when you're trying to leave. You push it open. Cold air rushes in. It smells like mud manure in dawn. You step outside. Behind you, the tavern doesn't sigh. It doesn't call you back. It simply returns to being what it always was, a pocket of flickering light in a world that rarely offers warmth without a price. But for one night you paid in coin and stories, and the tavern gave you something rare belonging. The door swings shut behind you. And somewhere, from deep inside, the goat sneezes. Medieval taverns weren't just places to eat and drink, they were the heartbeat of daily life. In their smoky, chaotic warmth, you found more than stew and ale. You found music fights, gossip secret deals, whispered desires, and unexpected camaraderie. These rough-hewn spaces were lawless, yet loyal, wild, yet welcoming. Everyone passed through them, peasants, knights, thieves, even sheriffs, each leaving behind a footprint in sawdust and a story in the air. No two nights were ever the same, and yet every night served the same purpose: survival, escape, and belonging. Whether you stayed an hour or became part of the furniture, one thing was certain: the medieval tavern remembered you long after you left. So what would your role have been had you walked through that door? You tilt your head skyward, squinting through the haze of a midsummer morning, and what you see isn't just a blue expanse. It's a whole library of unspoken warnings. The sky, in the eyes of a medieval farmer, is less like scenery and more like a daily bulletin. You don't need a clock, a barometer, or a forecast read out by a man in a fancy suit. You need eyes that squint just right and a memory sharpened by hunger. Because when your harvest depends on whether the clouds are flirting with mischief or mercy, you learn to watch the heavens the way a gambler watches the dealer's hands. The clouds, for instance, are not just fluff. High, thin streaks, what we now call cirrus, often stretch across the sky, like a sigh from God. To you, this means one thing: change is coming, and probably wet. But if the clouds are thick and low swelling like bruises, you'd better start herding the animals into shelter. There's no suspense here. It's just math, really ancient, grubby, instinctive math. Of course, medieval people didn't call them cirrus or cumulonimbus. They didn't categorize cloud formations in Latin like modern meteorologists with neat PowerPoints, but they described them all the same. Shepherds muttered about mares' tails or butter-churn clouds. Why? Because to survive in a world without Doppler radar, you had to be poetic out of necessity. When words are your only tools, metaphors sharpen like knives. You also notice the sun isn't always golden. Some days it rises red and angry, a glowing ember half draped in mist. And you know what they say, red sky at morning shepherd's warning. It's not just a rhyme, it's inherited wisdom. A red sunrise means moisture in the atmosphere, and wind from the east, often a cruel prelude to a storm. Meanwhile, a red sky at night. That's a farmer's delight, meaning stable weather is likely coming. Sailors loved it too, by the way, but we'll stick to the fields for now. It's not only color. The sun's clarity matters. If it shimmers behind a strange halo, a soft white ring like a crown of frost, you feel a shiver, not from cold, but from knowing. That halo forms when ice crystals high in the atmosphere catch the light, and they only gather when wet weather is stalking the horizon. It's like the sky is wearing a warning badge, plain as daylight. And then, of course, there's the moon. You glance at it while trudging home from the tavern or peeking through the thatch before bed. If it's unusually bright or has a ring around it, you mutter a quiet prayer and pull your cloak tighter. That glowing ring again means moisture in the upper sky. You don't need to explain the physics. You just know it means your barley could be soaked by dawn if you're not careful. Do you ever look at the moon like that now? Probably not, unless your power's out or you're camping. Funny, isn't it? How quickly we forgot the night sky once we built ceilings between us and the stars. But back then, there was no forgetting. You couldn't afford to. The sky was your clock, your calendar, and your early warning system. A farmer might not be able to read, but they could read the sky better than most modern scientists can read a spreadsheet. Because knowing when to sow, or reap, or hide from a storm wasn't just convenience, it was survival. Sometimes the sky even lied, or so it seemed. A perfectly clear afternoon might still end in rain if the wind flipped unexpectedly. But more often than not, the signs were there. You just had to know where to look. A slightly dimmer sun, a growing tension in the clouds, or that odd sense that the light was somehow wrong. Ever seen that weird golden glow before a thunderstorm? That eerie yellow-orange filter that makes the grass look too green and the shadows too sharp. Medieval farmers noticed it too. They just didn't Instagram it. So while you're sipping your weather app data over morning coffee, try to imagine relying on nothing but instinct and sky scanning to guess whether you should plant oats today or not. No percentages, no maps, just clouds that look too full, a sun that glares like it knows something, and a moon that whispers omens through thin silver veils. And no, this wasn't a hobby. This was day-to-day decision-making, with consequences that involved actual starvation. If you guessed wrong, it wasn't just a soggy picnic. It was moldy grain, dead livestock, or a roof caved in on your drying hay. Nobody ever said, surviving the Middle Ages was charming. You wipe the sweat from your brow and glance at the clouds again just in case. They haven't moved, but somehow they seem moodier. Maybe the sky is playing tricks, or maybe you've finally learned how to read it. You hear them before you see them, birds flitting through hedgerows, wings rustling like impatient whispers. And suddenly they stop. Not a chirp, not a flutter. Just silence so thick it presses on your chest. That right there is your forecast. Something is coming. Something the birds don't like. You learn to trust the creatures around you, not because they explain themselves, but because they've been right more often than not. A flock of swallows swooping low across a field isn't putting on a show for your amusement. They're chasing insects that, thanks to a shift in pressure, are flying closer to the ground. Low-flying swallows mean low pressure, and low pressure means storms. To a medieval farmer, those birds are basically a feathery barometer with wings and a schedule you ignore at your own peril. Cows, on the other hand, move with the patience of monks, but even they speak in their own slow, muddy way. When cows lie down en masse, it's not because they're tired of standing, it's because the air feels heavy and their instincts whisper of rain. It's not foolproof, but if you see a whole pasture flattened like a row of shaggy rugs, you tighten the barn ropes, or at least grumble about how the thatch will never dry in time now. And then there are bees. Yes, bees. Those buzzing little sugar merchants are nature's most precise flyers until something messes with the air. Before a storm, bees tend to huddle, vanish, or grow agitated. Their flight patterns get jumpy, erratic. You might even catch one bonking into a post like it's had too much mead. They're not drunk. They're warning you that wind and moisture are about to make life a nightmare. You take note. Even chickens, those fluffy, gossipy bundles of nerves, get jumpy before a downpour. They cluck more fluff up their feathers and look for places to roost earlier than usual. You don't need a meteorologist when your coop sounds like a clucking panic room. And if your rooster goes silent before dusk, that's either divine intervention or something very wet is on the horizon. Do you have a pet? Ever noticed how your dog whines before a thunderstorm or hides in the laundry? That instinct didn't evolve last week. It's ancient. You might have the heating on and weather alerts flashing on your phone, but your furry companion is still wired to read the air better than most satellites. It's the same sixth sense that medieval farmers relied on, but dialed into every chicken, cow, and goat in the yard. One famous medieval herbalist, Hildegard of Bingen, wasn't just into potions and chants. She wrote about how animals could predict storms with greater accuracy than humans because they weren't distracted by human nonsense. They weren't trying to be clever. They just were. And being was enough. And let's not forget horses. Oh, the drama of a horse before a pressure drop. Ears twitching, eyes wide, stomping like they've heard news from the heavens. Before a thunderstorm, they might refuse to be saddled or bolt for the corner of the paddock. In battle, this was dangerous. In farming. Still annoying, but at least you'd know to pull the plow in early. Now picture this. You watching a cluster of sheep scratch their faces into a fence post, like they've got the same mysterious itch. Could be midges. Could also be a change in humidity and air pressure. Turns out, sheep have sensitive sinuses. And if they're sneezing in unison, that's not allergies. That's weather. It's almost comedic, the whole barnyard turning into a symphony of subtle panic. You don't need a weatherman. You've got an orchestra. A twitch of a tail, a nervous glance, a sudden group nap, they all become symbols. You decode them like a priest reads omens in a bowl of water. Even the absence of behavior speaks volumes. If the bees are gone, the birds are still, and the livestock looks like it's trying not to breathe too loudly. You start tying knots in your gut. It's not normal. Something's off, and it's not the kind of off you ignore unless you want tomorrow's bread to turn moldy in the oven because your grain was soaked overnight. Sometimes, of course, the animals just act weird for no reason. A goat might climb on top of the stable roof because it's a goat, and chaos is its middle name. But more often than not, the behavior shifts mean something. You just need enough time, enough storms, and enough half-rotten cabbages to start seeing the patterns. When every meal depends on your ability to predict the unpredictable, You stop laughing at the chickens. You start paying attention. You don't see the wind, but you feel it. You taste it too, if you've been outside long enough. And in medieval life, you're always outside. The wind in all its invisible drama is one of your most chatty neighbors. It doesn't just blow. It speaks. And some days, it absolutely yells. You learn to notice when the wind suddenly shifts like a friend turning cold mid-sentence. A southern breeze might smell sweet, full of warmth and promise, perfect for drying that freshly washed tunic, or helping your barley bask just a bit longer. But when it flips whipping out of the north with a chill that bites through wool, you mutter under your breath. That's not just a change in temperature, it's a warning. Cold northern winds often precede rough weather or unexpected frost. And if you're not prepared, your cabbages won't be the only thing going limp. Then there's the western wind. It's usually damp, dragging moisture inland from the sea, even if you live nowhere near the coast. You can almost taste it metallic sour, something clinging to your teeth. Western winds mean rain, usually steady, sometimes endless. A week of it can drown a field, or turn the village road into a boot-stealing pit. And let's not even talk about trying to dry firewood in it. Ever lit a fire with wet wood after 3 days of drizzle? You'd have better luck rubbing two sad thoughts together. In contrast, the eastern wind is eerie. It carries dust dryness and a kind of silence that settles too heavily in your ears. Crops wither faster, the sky gets hazy, and the whole village seems crankier. In fact, in many medieval towns, people believed the east wind made you irritable, or worse, brought plague. Was it scientific? No. But after a few dry spells and mysterious coughs, you'd believe it too. You don't have a windsock, but you've got better your own skin. You feel which way the breeze hits your face as you bend to draw water or hoe a row of beans. A sudden gust across your left cheek while planting tells you to hurry up. You might not make it to supper before the storm hits. No alarms, just your senses doing the heavy lifting. Have you ever noticed how modern people barely feel the wind anymore? You move from your sealed house to your sealed car to your sealed office. Wind is something that messes your hair. Back then, it was practically a language. Even the way smoke moves from a chimney tells you everything. If it rises straight up, the air is stable, calm. You exhale in relief. But if it whips sideways or curls erratically, pressure is shifting fast. That's your cue to bring the animals closer to the barn and pray the roof holds this time. Spoiler alert, it usually doesn't. And then there's that strange moment when the wind stops altogether. A sudden stillness that feels wrong. The leaves don't rustle, the chickens stop gossiping, and even the stream down the hill seems quieter. That kind of hush isn't peace, it's a pause before chaos. Thunderstorms love a dramatic entrance, and nothing sets the stage like eerie calm followed by a sky-splitting roar. Imagine you're stacking hay. The sun's out. The air's heavy. Then bam, gusts start swirling dust devils around your feet, and a low groan pushes through the trees. You don't need a chart. You just drop the rake and run. Because you've seen this scene before, and the ending usually involves rain-soaked everything and regret. Real historical figures noticed it too. English chronicler Matthew Paris, writing in the 13th century, described a storm that arrived out of nowhere as the wind turned about like a serpent striking villages in all directions. He didn't have a forecast, but he had eyes, ears, and probably very strong instincts for ducking at the right time. Some monasteries even assigned monks to note wind patterns for planting calendars. not out of superstition, but from decades of watching what worked. Monks didn't like wasting seed or ale. A gust can knock your hat off, or slap a shutter open, sure. But to a medieval farmer, it also blows open a window into the future. And if you're listening, really listening, the wind says everything. You turn toward the breeze again, feeling the faint edge of dampness in it. Smells like rain. Tastes like it too. Time to haul in the laundry again. You step out just before sunrise, boots crunching the hardened soil, and pause. Then you look down. Is the grass wet? Are your toes soaked? Welcome to your medieval version of a morning forecast delivered not by app, but by dew. Dew isn't just a pretty sparkle clinging to the meadow. It's a weather memo. When the night's been clear and still and the grass greets you soaked, you smile. That's stability. A peaceful night, a gentle morning, no storms in sight. But if the dew's absent, or patchy and thin, you furrow your brow. A clouded sky, or rising wind, may have blocked its formation. Something unsettled has passed through. And then there's frost, the rude cousin of dew. You step outside hoping for glistening blades, and instead, your cabbage leaves crunch like old parchment. That's not just cold, it's betrayal. If the frost sneaks in too early, it can ruin crops that still needed a few more weeks of life. You learn to gauge how the season is really going, not by dates, but by the first frost that kills your basil. Did medieval peasants use the calendar for planting? Of course, but only as a loose guide, because frost doesn't care what month it is. You don't plant because it's April. You plant because the soil, the dew, the breath of the earth says it's safe. Or not. Sometimes dew itself becomes a performance. Have you ever noticed that dew clings differently? Heavy beads on some mornings, just a whisper of moisture on others. A deep, thick dew signals a cooler, calmer night. Great for sleep. Not great if you were hoping to thresh grain. It means drying it. Today will be slow and annoying. A farmer in 14th century France, for example, might delay his hay cutting by hours or even a whole day because the dew was thick and clinging like a gossip. And gossip, like wet hay, tends to stick around longer than you'd like, especially when mold threatens to ruin your winter feed. Now about those soggy boots. If you've ever walked into a dewy meadow at dawn, you know the feeling. Within 3 steps, your feet are damp, your socks are protesting, and you regret every decision you made involving open footwear. Back then, leather shoes soaked up the morning dew like bread and soup, and you couldn't afford 5 pairs of boots. So you paid attention. Wet feet at dawn might mean a clear day, but only if the dew formed properly. Of course, dew wasn't just a mood ring for weather. It was considered medicinal, even magical. Some folk healers believed collecting dew at sunrise on May Day brought luck or cured warts. Others thought it kept wrinkles away. Not quite SPF 50, but hey, it's nature's moisturizer. And if you're already checking it for storm warnings, might as well rub some on your elbows too. Oddly enough, even the act of not getting dew can tell you something. A warm, humid night should leave everything drenched by morning. If your yard is bone dry, something's amiss. Maybe the air moved too much. Maybe clouds covered the stars. Either way, it's nature's way of saying, don't count on a predictable day ahead. And medieval folks weren't guessing. They watched patterns year after year from generation to generation. Grandfathers told sons, who told their sons what kind of dew came before the best harvest. What kind came before storms, or worse, hail. Yes, hail. The nightmare of farmers. It arrives like a drunk guest at a quiet party and leaves your crops looking like they've been through a food processor. Ever heard the rhyme, "If frost follows dew, expect more too"? There were dozens of sayings like this, not because peasants had too much time, but because poetry helped you survive. If you could remember the rhymes, you could remember the risks. Dew might seem delicate romantic even if you live in the city, but to you, the medieval farmer, it's as practical as a bucket and more revealing than a confession. Whether you hang your linen to dry or rush to cover the beans, dew gives you your marching orders. And today the dew came heavy, but the air feels twitchy. You can sense it in your fingers, in your nose. The sun may be rising, but you keep your eyes low, scanning the ground, listening to the earth's wet whisper. You look up just as the sun dips low. And there it is again, that reddish hue, bleeding across the horizon like the sky's caught fire. It's beautiful, yes, but also ominous. Because in your world, color isn't just decoration, it's communication. And red skies speak volumes. The phrase dances on your tongue without effort. Red sky at night shepherd's delight. Red sky and morning shepherd's warning. You don't know who came up with it, but you've lived enough seasons to know it holds. A red sunset means stable air is pushing in from the west. Good news, a dry tomorrow, but a red sunrise. That means weather systems are shifting in the opposite direction, bringing in moisture chaos and regret. Modern folks call it Rayleigh scattering, but you just call it bad news in a pretty frame. That pinkish glow behind the hills at 5 a.m., it doesn't fool you. It means get up now, tie down the bundles, and pray the oats hold. Then there's the moon. Oh, the moon. You've watched her from your field, from your doorway, even through the hole in your roof when it leaks just right. And sometimes she's got a ring, a pale halo wrapping her like a solemn crown. You pause when you see that. The ring isn't rare, but it matters. A haloed moon means ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, and that almost always precedes rain or snow within the next day or two. The bigger the ring, the more you worry. It's not superstition. It's a pattern. One you've watched over and over with a sinking stomach and damp hay. Think about it. Have you ever seen a glowing ring around the moon and not felt like something eerie was afoot? Medieval folks didn't need astrology to feel spooked. The sky already carried all the mystery and warning they could handle. Sometimes the moon isn't white at all. Sometimes she turns yellow-orange, even red. You've seen it hanging low, like a bruised fruit just above the tree line. And when the moon goes red, especially during harvest, you don't cheer. You brace yourself. Dust, smoke, or high humidity can tint her like that. And often, it signals changing air and unpredictable weather. A blood moon in June might just mean a dramatic photo today, but for you, it means mildew on your stored beans if you don't act fast. And then there are the stars. You may not study constellations like a noble's astronomer, but you still know when they vanish. If the night sky seems suddenly blank, no stars poking through something's brewing. A thickening veil above. You've walked home under those empty skies before and woken up to dripping rafters. If you lived near the sea, or even a large river, you'd also watch how light flickered on the water. Some said if the moonlight shimmered in broken streaks, the winds would shift before dawn. Others watched the glow on the horizon from distant storms pulsing like ghost lanterns and counted the seconds to guess how fast the clouds were coming. One curious 13th century Englishman, John of Wallingford, kept a record of such signs in his monastery log. He noted that on evenings with glowing rings about the moon and a sky as red as bloodstorms, often struck within 2 nights, always in harshness. It wasn't prophecy, it was fieldwork. Cloaked in robes, sure, but practical as any peasant. And you, as a farmer, didn't just glance up for fun. You had to. Roofs leaked, grain spoiled, animals died in the mud if left out overnight. One missed signal, and you might go hungry for weeks. So watching the sky wasn't just poetry, it was survival training. Do you remember when sunsets were just sunsets? Or do you ever catch yourself, even now, wondering what that orange glow means for tomorrow? The instincts haven't left. They've just gotten quiet. But in your time, they're loud. You step outside, and the sun is setting in stripes deep crimson, then gold, then ash gray. You squint. You tilt your head. And without thinking, you begin to prepare. The color of the sky has spoken. You don't trust the trees, not entirely. They don't move much. They don't warn you with sound or eyes or frantic motion like animals do. But they do react quietly, subtly, and sometimes more honestly than any beast in the barn. You've learned that plants get nervous before a storm. The trick is learning to spot it. Take the leaves. They flip. Not a metaphor, they literally flip. On some trees, especially poplars or oaks, the underside of the leaf is paler, smoother, almost silvery. When the wind ahead of a storm stirs up the air pressure, those leaves turn like startled birds. Suddenly, the whole tree looks upside down. You'd think the tree was showing its belly, but it's not surrender, it's warning. Then there are the flowers. You'd think they'd be the last to gossip about weather, but no. Some like dandelions or clovers close up before rain. You've seen it dozens of times, sun still out, but the blooms have already zipped themselves into tight little balls. It's like they know something you don't. And they do. They respond to humidity, pressure, temperature shifts. When they shut, it's not a fashion choice. It's defense. Wet petals are ruined petals. Imagine you're walking through the village, passing by a hedge of morning glories. Yesterday, they opened wide in hopeful faces toward the dawn. Today, they're sulking, closed tight. You don't even need to check the sky. You just sigh, adjust your hat, and mutter something unkind about the laundry you forgot to bring in. Medieval farmers didn't call it botany. They called it wisdom. You don't need a degree when you've watched the same tree for 15 years. When it drops its leaves early, the frost will come sooner than usual. When the barley heads bend too far without wind rains on the way. It's all there if you're patient and very slightly paranoid. Even grass participates in this strange botanical gossip. Before a heavy rain, it can feel too soft, too damp underfoot, even without visible moisture. It wilts just slightly, like it's bracing for the weight to come. You notice the shift with your feet first, then your eyes. And you learn to trust the soles of your shoes more than the sky on those days. Let's talk about mold, the great uninvited guest. Medieval farmers dreaded mold more than taxes. When the air turned too still and the plants felt too lush too soon, you knew you were entering dangerous territory. Too much moisture, not enough circulation. You could almost hear the mildew sharpening its knives. Even fruits get chatty if you know how to listen. Apples, for instance, will drop prematurely if they sense changing air conditions. A tree that starts shedding fruit early is not just being moody, it's reading the barometer of the earth and deciding it's better to let go than fight the storm. Have you ever left a houseplant outside before a summer thunderstorm? Hours before the first drop, the leaves droop. The soil darkens. The whole plant seems to hold its breath. That's instinct. Not science, not magic, just ancient cellular memory. The same kind medieval farmers watched in the whole forest. And fungi. If mushrooms start blooming in strange places along dry walls under new hedges, you brace yourself. They flourish in damp, disturbed environments. Their appearance often means the underground network of roots and moisture is shifting. They're not pretty. They're prophetic. One medieval superstition claimed that if ivy started creeping faster than usual, a flood was coming. Was it accurate sometimes? But here's the thing about superstitions. They usually start with one guy noticing something and then not dying. That gets people's attention. Sometimes it wasn't about what plants did, but what they didn't do. A fruit tree that failed to bloom might not just be cursed. It might be reacting to a winter that hung on too long, or a drought buried in spring's shadow. Medieval farmers noticed. They didn't call it climate change. They just planted fewer beans and hoped for mercy. Even weeds spoke their minds. Plantain leaves that stayed close to the ground suggested heat and dryness. Ones that stood tall hinted at moisture on the way. Not exciting conversation, but useful. And usefulness kept you fed. So you walk through your field, the air thick and unmoving. The clovers curled, the leaves are flipped, and even the sunflowers look suspicious. You don't run. You don't panic. You just nod and quietly move the drying onions inside. The plants have already made their choice. You stop mid-step because something's changed, not in the sky, not in the soil, but in your nose. A smell. Sharp, sudden, oddly comforting in its warning. It's the smell of rain. And even before the first drop hits, you know it's coming. To someone living centuries ago, this scent isn't just background. It's signal. The air thickens with a scent like iron, and earth like wet stones, and moss like something waking up beneath your boots. You don't have a word for it yet, but modern folks do petrichor. That earthy perfume that rises just before a storm, born from oils, released by plants and soil when hit by moisture. You smell it long before the sky darkens. You don't need to know the chemistry. Your nose is smarter than your vocabulary. In fact, it might be your most underrated forecasting tool. Because in the Middle Ages, where you don't have warnings churning out of metal towers and satellites, your senses have to do the talking. And smell, oddly enough, has a lot to say. Smell changes with wind, with pressure, with temperature. Ever notice how the village stinks more just before it rains? That's not just imagination. Rising humidity carries scents farther, thickening the air with manure mold and wet dog if you're lucky. Less lucky. You catch the scent of the tannery 2 hills over, and suddenly you're very motivated to get the washing off the line before the downpour arrives. It's not just human noses on alert. Dogs get twitchy sniffing the air and pacing in circles like they've caught wind of something invisible. Horses sniff the breeze and snort ears turning like weather vanes. The entire farmyard becomes a parade of sniffers, from pigs rooting anxiously to cats blinking wide-eyed under eaves. They smell it too. The storm, the change, the wetness, waiting just out of sight. Some medieval folk believed that certain people had a divine nose, like a baker could smell a storm 3 villages away, or a shepherd could tell the difference between wet and flood. Was it mysticism maybe? Or maybe it was just experience, hard-earned over 100 washing days, ruined, and dozens of shoes muddied beyond saving. You learn how wet things smell after they've dried wrong. You know what happens when damp straw doesn't air out in time. That smell becomes fear. and it lingers on clothes and barns in your own sleeves. And sometimes the smell is cold. You catch a faint scent of snow in the air before the sky changes color. It's dry, sterile, but with a hint of metallic edge like biting into frozen air. Before long, even the animals start moving slower. The scent of snow is like silence turned into smell. You prepare accordingly. Stack firewood. Move feed. Brace the shutters with extra care. It's coming. Then there are the smells that lie. The false comfort of warm, sweet breezes after a muggy day can be misleading. The air smells clean, but you still don't trust it. Because sometimes the scent comes too early, too bright. That's when you start to suspect hail is hiding behind the next hour. Medieval farmers called it the still before the break. Sweet air often masks sour intentions. Have you ever been walking outside and suddenly the air smells sharper, like crushed greenery and wet iron? That's what lightning smells like. Or rather, the ozone that trails its wake. In your medieval life, when you catch that scent, especially on a hot summer day, you don't wait around. You cover the well. You keep metal tools indoors. You pray the storm strikes the old oak tree down the road, not the chimney above your head. And sometimes, just sometimes, the air stops smelling like anything at all. That's worse. That's when you know the storm isn't hours away, it's minutes. Because the calm before the storm isn't just quiet, it's scentless. The smell disappears. The earth holds its breath. And you do too. In all this, you realize something oddly comforting. Your body has always known the truth. Long before radars and forecasts, the weather spoke to your nerves, your lungs, your skin, especially your nose. You pause at the gate, the smell of fresh dirt and rising humidity curling around your face. You don't need to look up. The storm's already whispered its arrival through your nostrils. You lie in bed, eyes half-lidded, blanket pulled up to your chin. The fire's low, the night's quiet, but not that quiet. Outside, your wooden shutter, something chirps. Again, then a chorus. Crickets. Frogs. The full medieval midnight orchestra tuning up for another show. But here's the catch. You're not just listening for ambiance. You're listening for patterns. Because these little noisemakers don't just fill the silence, they forecast it. You notice it after a while. When the frogs fall silent, a storm usually follows. Or when the crickets chirp faster, the night is warmer than usual. They're not being dramatic. They're reacting to pressure, temperature, and humidity. Creatures too small to build a barn, but wise enough to move before the rain starts. Frogs in particular become barometers with legs. After long, dry spells, when they suddenly emerge and start croaking like their lives depend on it, it's usually because the air has shifted moistures in the wind. And they know. You might not see the clouds, but if the frogs are celebrating, you'd best go check the hayloft. Their chorus isn't random. It's a rhythm driven by survival. Wet soil, warm nights, low pressure. Perfect for frog karaoke. And then there are the crickets. You've heard them 1,000 times, but have you ever really listened? Their chirping isn't just background noise. It speeds up as the temperature rises. Count the chirps in a set number of seconds, and you can guess the air's warmth within a degree or two. That's not folklore. That's cricket-based meteorology. In modern times, scientists call it Dolbear's Law. But medieval folks didn't need a formula. They just noticed that when the crickets chirped fast, the night stayed gentle. When they slowed down or went silent, something wicked this way came. Other insects joined the concert. Cicadas buzz louder on dry, sweltering days, almost offensively so. But if the evening's quiet, And still, if even the bugs can't be bothered, you know something's off. It's the insect equivalent of holding their breath, and you seasoned by years of ruinous weather and moldy grain know to do the same. Have you ever noticed how modern life drowns out these sounds? Air conditioning hums, street traffic roars, earbuds buzz with podcasts. But in your medieval world, every chirp stands out. Every silence is suspicious. It's not just about noise, it's about who is making it when and why they might stop. Sometimes the signals get weird. Bats fly lower when storms approach, chasing insects drawn down by heavy air. Swarms of midges suddenly vanish, and the night feels strangely empty. You light a candle and check your traps. You're not afraid, just aware. And that's all a farmer really needs. Historical records don't often mention bug songs, but they linger in oral tradition. Old songs and sayings warn that when frogs go still and crickets hide sleep light, or not at all. It's not poetry, it's insurance. You sleep light, so you can leap up at the first drip from the roof or creak of a shifting shutter. And let's not forget birds. Yes, they sing at dawn, but if they start chirping earlier than usual, fluttering about restlessly, or vanish altogether, you might be dealing with a pressure drop. Some medieval villagers claimed swallows could see the wind diving low before the rain. In truth, they were chasing bugs who in turn were avoiding turbulence. But the result's the same nature moves in anticipation, and you've trained yourself to notice it. Have you ever spent a night in nature and suddenly realized it was too quiet? That eerie stillness that prickles your skin. Medieval folks knew that too. When the nighttime symphony stops, you don't roll over, you get up and check your world. That silence might be nothing, or it might be everything. So here you are lying still, ears wide, eyes closed. The frogs are loud tonight. The crickets keep time. A good sign, you think. But then, one frog goes quiet. Another. The chorus stumbles. The wind picks up ever so slightly. And in that subtle shift of sound, your instincts awaken. It's time to prepare, because something's coming. You kneel in the dirt, back-aching hands gritty, and mutter something that's not quite a prayer and not quite a curse. The sky's been playing tricks for days, and you're not sure what to believe anymore. So you do what your grandfather did, and his before him. You reach for rhyme. It comes to you without thinking, half-whispered, like muscle memory of the tongue oak. Before ash, we're in for a splash. Ash before oak, we're in for a soak. You don't know who said it first, but you've seen enough wet seasons to know there's truth buried in that dirt poet logic. You watch which tree gets its leaves first. Oak good. Just a little rain. Ash bad. Bring a bucket. This is peasant science at its finest, weather lore passed down not in scrolls or sermons, but in sayings. These aren't jokes. These are survival rhymes. Rhythmic insurance policies. You might not have a barometer, but you've got a brain full of old lines, and that's enough. Take this one. When the wind's in the west, the weather's at its best. When the wind's in the east, it's neither good for man nor beast. Not exactly Shakespeare, but you'd bet your last loaf it'll hold true, more often than not. Even your planting follows prophecy. Sow, dry, and set wet meaning plant in dry soil, but make sure it's watered afterward. Not because it sounds nice, but because you've watched too many careless neighbors lose a season's yield because they mistimed to sprinkle. You've also heard rain before 7 fine by 11. It gives you hope when dawn arrives weeping over your thatch. You wait. You watch. And sometimes, often in fact, it clears. A small victory sung in rhyme. Have you ever had an elder say something baffling that turned out to be scarily accurate? That's how it feels when someone mumbles, "A halo round the moon means rain very soon," and then it actually pours the next day. You're annoyed. You're amazed. You add it to your internal playlist of weird but useful truths. Some of these old lines get downright poetic. Mackerel sky and mare's tails make tall ships carry low sails. That one came from the coast, but drifted inland over generations. It warns of high cirrus clouds streaking across the sky, like a brushed canvas signs of moisture and a brewing front. You don't need to own a tall ship. You just need to decide whether to hang the linen out or not. And there's a certain comfort in it all. These rhymes turn the randomness of nature into something you can hold on to, something you can repeat while chopping firewood or pacing under a restless sky. They're less about control, more about rhythm, an attempt to dance with weather rather than run from it. You've probably noticed something similar in modern life too. Ever catch yourself saying, "April showers bring May flowers," without thinking, or "red sky at night sailor's delight"? Congratulations, you've inherited peasant wisdom in a branded world. The old instincts are still there, they've just dressed up a bit. There were even counting rituals. Some villagers believed that if you counted the number of fogs in May, you'd know how many snowfalls to expect that winter. It sounds silly until you try it, and it hits right more often than chance should allow. These sayings weren't written in ink. They were scratched into lives, burned into memory by failed crops, ruined weddings, and lightning-charred barns. So you trust them, not blindly, but earnestly, because in a world where a bad weather call can mean empty cellars and thin soup, you hold on to anything that gives you a sense of prediction. And when the sky goes pale, and the wind flips, and your sheep sneeze, and the oak still hasn't leafed, you don't panic. You just say the line again, low and steady. Oak before ash? You might be fine. You might not. But you'll face it like your ancestors did, with dirt under your nails and rhymes on your lips. You did everything right. Watched the clouds. Listened to the frogs. Counted the crickets. Sniffed the air. Watched the leaves turn. Recited every rhyme your wrinkled aunt ever whispered through her toothless grin. And still, somehow, the sky betrayed you. The rain arrived sideways. The wind howled like it had a personal grudge. Your carefully stacked hay toppled into the mud like it had lost the will to live. And the barn door, which you definitely did, latch now, swings wide like a drunk monk. So what? Now you grumble. Maybe you curse. Maybe you laugh. Because honestly, what else can you do? The truth is, and you've known this all along, the weather plays its own game. Nature isn't here to be tamed. It's here to be survived. For every time the dew gave a good forecast, there was a frost that snuck in like a thief. For every cricket choir that chirped faithfully, there was a night so still and silent that it made your bones ache. Sometimes the frogs lie. Sometimes the clouds bluff. Sometimes the sun beams down with warmth and love until the hail shows up 15 minutes later and shatters everything. And that's the thing, isn't it? You live not in control of the weather, but in conversation with it. Some days it speaks gently. Other days it screams. You're not its master. You're its translator, its dance partner, its reluctant admirer. You spend your life trying to predict a thing that refuses to be predicted. Still, you try again. You check the leaves, the wind, the bees. You step outside after the storm has passed, survey the damage, and begin the small, stubborn process of repair. You gather what didn't get soaked. You prop up what fell. You coax the chickens out of hiding and tell them everything's fine, even if it's not. That's what makes a farmer medieval or not. Not the certainty, not the tools, but the willingness to read 100 small signs and make 1,000 small decisions, even knowing that half of them might go wrong. You do it anyway, because your life, your food, your family, it's all wrapped in the dirt and the sky. And the sky doesn't always keep its promises. You think back to that rhyme, if the sky is clear and the moon is bright, bring the sheep in before midnight. Well, you forgot. And now the sheep are wet. The roof is leaking, and the stew you left simmering in the hearth smells faintly of soot. But you're still here. And tomorrow you'll look at the sky again. Because sometimes the signs are right. Sometimes the dew warns you in time. Sometimes the bees stay out just long enough to let you finish the harvest. Sometimes the sky wears red at dusk, and the morning is truly delightful. Those are the days you live for. Not because they're easy, but because they make the hard days worth it. And besides, there's something noble in this endless guessing game. You're not just battling the elements. You're working with them, negotiating, adjusting, adapting. It's humbling, yes. But it's also kind of beautiful, isn't it? You stretch your back, soaked, but still breathing, and look up once more. The sky's already changing again. Lighter now. A little less cruel. You squint. Maybe today will be kinder. Then you smell it, that fresh, wet earth scent, gentle this time. And the frogs have resumed their concert. The crickets follow. The leaves settle back into place. The world hasn't ended, just reset. So you begin again, farmer. You watch. You listen. You wait. Because in the end, predicting the weather without tools isn't just about staying dry. It's about staying human. So, tonight, as you drift off beneath soft blankets and modern ceilings, take a quiet moment to remember the sky above the same sky. Medieval farmers watched with bare eyes and hopeful hearts. No gadgets, no forecasts, just instinct observation and ancient wisdom whispered through clouds, leaves and frogs. They read the world like a living book, one page at a time, trusting nature's clues to guide their every choice. And somehow, despite the chaos they endured, may their simple strength wrap around you like comfort. May your dreams be gentle, your sleep deep, and your heart peaceful. Good night, traveler of time. May tomorrow's weather be kinder, and may you always know when to bring the laundry in